We're going to start in a few minutes the Wheat Ridge City Council study session for April the 6th, 2020. Good evening, and thank you all for joining us. Before we begin tonight's meeting, I would like to welcome everyone to our virtual meeting, and I would like to explain this format. Tonight, we have our City Council members and staff visible on a live video feed. Members of the public have been invited to comment on Wheat Ridge Speaks in advance of the meeting, or to participate live through a web link or by calling in on the telephone. All members of the public who are participating live have been muted at this time. When the time for Citizens' Right to Speak comes, I will unmute all of the members of the public and ask you to speak in order based on the first letter of your last name. Further instructions will be provided at that time. When we unmute the public, please keep background noise to a minimum. You may choose to mute yourself through your own device. If you do not plan to speak at all this evening, we recommend you simply view the meeting live by watching Channel 8 or on wheatridgespeaks.org. If you do plan to speak this evening, when you speak, please clearly state your first and last name. Please spell your last name and give your street address for the record. Because of this virtual format, I will ask the council if there are any objections to waive the council rules, so we receive comment during Citizens' Right to Speak on items that are on the agenda, as is our practice with study sessions. We do not entertain comment at study sessions that is not on the agenda. Please limit your public comments to 3 minutes per speaker. And we are not permitting the donation of time to another speaker. When there are no more speakers, I will close the time for public comment and the public participation will be muted. We appreciate your patience with this virtual format. As with our in-person meetings, we hope that we create a friendly and respectful atmosphere for public dialogue. And we appreciate your help with this process. Thank you. With that, I would like to call to order the study session for the City Council for the City of Wheat Ridge, Colorado for April 6th, 2020.
Mr. Mayor.
We have Mr. Clerk, are you able to call the roll of the members so that we know who is here?
Ms. Hobby.
Present.
Ms. Hutchinson.
Here.
Mr. Urban.
Present.
Ms. Holteen.
Present.
Dr. Weaver.
Here.
Mr. Stites.
Here.
Ms. Dozeman.
Here.
Ms. Nosler-Beck.
I understand she may have had a little bit of technical problem getting in on the internet, so hopefully she'll be able to join us.
Mr. Mayor, we have a quorum, even though we don't need one.
Okay, thank you very much. We are now at the time for Citizens' Right to Speak on any agenda item.
Mr. Mayor.
Yes, sir.
My question is regarding the inability to donate time within a study session. Why is it that we would not allow the donation of time for up to 2 speakers as permitted by the rules?
We had modified our rules at the last meeting because of the virtual format and the ability to sort of make all that come together.
For that particular meeting, but not our rules as they stand, correct?
Okay. Let me go and see if we have a consensus on council to change the rules so that we would limit content to 3 minutes per speaker. We have consensus on council to do that for tonight's meeting. Can the clerk give us, let's see, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hands. I show 6 hands. So that would be a consensus among the members. Do we have a consensus among the members to not permit donation of time from one speaker to another speaker? Please raise your hand if you favor that rule change for tonight's meeting. Okay, it looks like that we then will allow donation of time from one speaker to another. So if you are in line to speak and you would like to donate your time to another speaker, please indicate when I call on you to speak. Thank you. Okay. If you're a member of the public and wish to speak during our meeting tonight, now is your time. We will not have another time for public comment during this meeting. Public microphones have been unmuted now. If you are not speaking, please mute your telephone. I will invite members of the public to speak based on the first letter of your last name. When I come to your position in the alphabet, please ask to be recognized and I will recognize you to speak. When I recognize you to speak, please speak clearly. Please state your first name and last name and spell your last name and give your street address for the record. Is there anyone wishing to speak tonight from the public on any agenda item whose last name begins with the letter A through E? Please speak now and I will recognize you. Speakers with the last name beginning with A or E. I don't hear anyone. Okay, I will go. Is there anyone wishing to speak whose last name begins with the letter F through J? Please speak now and I will recognize you.
I would.
Okay.
Darka Figlus.
I hear a speaker. Would you please speak and identify yourself and give us your name and address, and then you may begin speaking.
Darka Figlus at 10580 West 34th Avenue in Wheat Ridge.
Please begin speaking.
Okay, so I wanted to speak to the fourth item on the agenda, which is participation in city council meetings, and in particular to any public hearings. And just wanted to remind council that it seems to me that the first duty of our government is to protect our rights, and that the right of referendum is a right that the people reserved to themselves when they wrote the state constitution. And it also states that home rule cities cannot interfere with that right. Now, per our charter and per the Constitution, we have the right to challenge any ordinance that is passed by city council. However, under this governor's order, there is no way for us to do that if a council passes an ordinance that we don't agree with. We can't do it without violating the governor's orders and without putting ourselves, our health, and our neighbors in the community at risk. So it seems to me that since all our governments, including council, and our oath of office, the first thing you swear to is to uphold the Constitution, and we look to you to protect our constitutional rights. So any actions that you take have to take that into account first and foremost. So there's really no way for you to conduct a public hearing during this time without interfering with our constitutional rights. So I wish that you would take that into consideration and postpone all public hearings until after this emergency is over so that we can safely conduct public hearings. And I ask that you do this before next Monday's meeting so everybody, applicant, staff, citizens are clear on what's happening, and you reduce the stress levels and anxieties associated with the uncertainties of what council might do next Monday. The other thing I wanted to add to this is that as you think about doing electronic only meetings, you have to take into account that there are a lot of people out there that do not have a facility with the internet or don't even have internet. And saying that they can participate by telephone is inadequate, because the only way that you can find out, that I know of, that you can find out that there's a meeting going on and how to participate is to go on the website. So again, it's kind of like you can't, it's a catch-22. You can't participate because you can't find out about it. You can't go someplace to find out about city council meetings and how to participate because that's violation of the governor's order. So, the city, without adequately informing citizens that you're going to have public hearings by electronic means.
Thank you, Ms. Figlis.
Okay, thank you.
Your time has expired. Thank you. Is there anyone wishing to speak whose last name begins with F through J? Please speak now and I will recognize you. Is there anyone wishing to speak whose last name begins with K through O? Speak now and I will recognize you to speak. Anyone wishing to speak whose last name begins with the letter K through O? Is there anyone wishing to speak now?
Hello.
Hello there, yes. Is there someone who wishes to speak?
Yeah, this is Ihor Figlis.
Okay. Mr. Figlis, I recognize you to speak. Please give us your first name, your last name, spell your last name and your address.
Ihor Figlis, F-I-G-L-U-S, 9775 West 36th Avenue.
Please proceed.
First of all, I'm getting some kind of a feedback. I'm getting a loop. I keep hearing you speaking. I hear your echo. As a matter of fact, I got to tell you, I've been trying to get on here for the last 15 minutes and only just was able to do it. I tried calling in. As a matter of fact, I can hear you speaking, Mayor, Mr. Mayor, right now while I'm speaking. And I couldn't get in on the phone line. I couldn't do that. And I had problems getting to this Zoom setting, this Zoom meeting as well. It took me almost 10 minutes to get to this Zoom meeting. So here's what I want to say. I want to say in general about this. I think City Council should call a special meeting and vote on a resolution to postpone all public hearings until after the City Council resumes normal meetings at Wheat Ridge City Hall. Nearby community have already done so. Public participation is an important part of governance and should not be lost in any of this. Government bodies should not opportunistically take advantage of public's inability to attend large gatherings to make critical decisions affecting the public's interest if those decisions can reasonably be postponed. Just as citizens are being asked to defer non-essential travel, errands, and so forth, so should government agencies defer non-critical policy-making decisions until full and meaningful public involvement can be guaranteed. As I've just proven, no matter how good the technology gets, virtual meetings will never substitute for in-person gatherings when it comes to conducting local civic business. Digital democracy complements our traditional governance processes, but isn't a substitute. As a matter of fact, I would say that you have no way to verify that it's actually me talking. You know, I've stated this, and I'm sure it's illegal that for me to misrepresent myself, but you don't know, who's actually calling in and who's speaking. Besides the problem of holding adequate public hearings, there's a problem of citizens not being able to exercise their constitutional right to hold referendums on city ordinances without violating governor's stay-at-home order and putting themselves and other citizens at severe risk. There are deadlines for referendums that cannot be complied with during the stay-at-home order. City Council must postpone all public hearings, and the first public hearing should take place only 2 weeks after normal City Council hearings resume. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else wishing to speak whose last name begins with the letter K through O? Please speak, and I will recognize you.
I'd like to speak. This is Margaret Nelson.
Mrs. Nelson, I will recognize you to speak. Please give us your first name and last name, and spell your last name, and give us your address. Please continue, Mrs. Nelson.
Odarka Figlis, who spoke before me. Can you hear me now? Have you heard what I've been saying? Okay.
No, ma'am.
You haven't heard me?
No, ma'am. I hear you. I hear you very clearly now. So if you'd like to
Well,
to start speaking, please give
Okay.
us your name and start speaking.
This is Margaret Nelson, 9865 West 37th Avenue. And I would like to echo the two people who spoke before me. The reason you couldn't hear me is that my system locked up for all of that time. You all froze on my screen. I was talking, but you were, I was live for me, but you were just frozen on my screen. Anyway, I think if the city wants to conduct important business, as the others have pointed out, using this technology, then you have to provide, I would think you should be providing every citizen in Wheat Ridge with high-speed internet and the training and the equipment to use it. Because if you don't do that, then people can't express themselves at your meetings, I think, it's okay, I think other cities have kind of postponed things until things calm down. I don't think you should, I'm calling specifically about the rezoning next to me. I don't think you should be deciding this kind of stuff while we're all under lockdown. What good does it do to post signs on the property if everybody's under lockdown order? Who's driving by to see those signs? I just think it's really unfair to be thinking about important things when people can't, as we've seen, people have trouble with this kind of connection, and it's just not fair to the citizenry, I don't think. So that's what I'd like to say. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Nelson. Is there anyone wishing to speak whose last name begins with the letter K through O? Please speak now and I will recognize you. Is there anyone wishing to speak whose last name begins with the letter P through T? Please speak now and I will recognize you. Last name beginning with P through T. Is there anyone wishing to speak whose last name begins with the letter U through Z? Please speak now and I will recognize you to speak.
Yes, this is Kerry Whitaker. Whitaker is Whitaker, and I'm at 6630 West 30th Avenue. And I'd like to thank City Council for holding this meeting and being nimble and accessible to us in these unusual times. And I'm here to talk a little bit about the short-term rentals that are on the agenda tonight. I think the memo that was proposed is a good foundation, but as someone who regulated the mortgage industry through the foreclosure and financial crisis in 2008, I think the city is going to need a few more tools. First one being, the city needs to have the ability to compel short-term rental owners to provide them with information. And they shouldn't have to do so through a subpoena. So those owners should be obligated to provide the city with what information they request. The city should also be able to subpoena information when necessary, such as from the VRBO platform, Airbnb, and anyone else that they want to get information from. Without the ability to have access to that information, it's going to be very difficult to enforce these measures. Secondly, I think the city needs a few more disciplinary tools. For people or owners who refuse to become registered, the city should have a cease and desist order ability. They should also be able to fine individuals who aren't registered or under their regulatory umbrella. For those who are registered, they should have the ability to summarily suspend them. This is an emergency provision that allows the city to immediately revoke their registration in case it's warranted and when there's undue harm. Should also be other lower levels of discipline, such as letters of admonishment and things like that. In regards to the fines proposed, it seems pretty unrealistic that the city is going to be able to determine fines and compliance on a daily basis. We've seen the city struggle with enforcing the illegality of short-term rentals in general, and the fact that they'd be able to do that on more specific requirements on a day-to-day basis, being able to count those days seems a little unrealistic. What I would suggest is having some broader language allowing the city fining authority of up to, say, maybe $5,000 per violation. That up to language that's in there allows the city to be as lenient or as rigid as they need to be, and they don't have to have someone out there counting the days or parked out to see when maybe these folks are renting out their places when they shouldn't be. So I think that's important to have some teeth behind this. And then next, there's a little in here in regards to cap or density issues of short-term rentals. On our street, you can hardly go 4 houses without running into one. I would suggest prohibiting non-owner or whole home rentals or allowing only Wheat Ridge residents to own short-term rentals in our city. Lastly, there should be a minimum night stay. I know Council Member Janice likes 1 night. I would propose 2 or 3. And corporations should not be allowed to own short-term rentals in our city.
Okay.
My time is up, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Whitaker. Is there anyone wishing to speak whose last name begins with the letter U through Z? Please speak up and I will recognize you to speak.
Yes, I would like to speak.
Yes, please state your name and address, and you may begin speaking.
Great. My name is Mike Pleiss. I apologize. My last name is P, but my connection cut out when you called on my name.
That's quite all right.
My address is 6670 West 30th Avenue, and I'd like to share a recent experience I have had with a short-term rental business across the street from my house. About 3 weeks ago, Thursday, March 19th, I had to start working short hours in order to meet the requirements of my work, cutting staffing, like many other businesses have faced. And I came home early and took my kids for a walk and met a young couple that was staying at the short-term rental across the street from my house. Well, they told me they just got in town from New York City and they were fleeing before the state would shut down all, business and travel, etc. I continued to see her the next 3 days when I'm walking through the street, and I'd say hello and keep my distance for the health and safety of my kids as well as myself. Well, 5 days later, the next week, I found myself walking by her driveway and her and the kids playing in the driveway of the rental house. And she said, "Stay away. I think we have it." Now, I had nothing against this person. I simply felt concerned for them and their family, as well as the health and wellness of my street. And it is my understanding that she went ahead and called the investor of the short-term rental business and let them know there was a high chance of them having the coronavirus. So the response we got was that the house was accurately cleaned as necessary and that it would be rented out again. Well, the next vehicle that showed up was from New York the next day, and there were 3 women and 2 more kids there, and they continued to stay for 2 nights. And then upon them leaving, another car pulled up with out-of-state license plate, and 3 men got out, and they stayed for a night. And then a few days later, another vehicle pulls up with Minnesota license plates. And then the very good concept of trying to minimize these to a 2-week stay was put in place. The current people staying there stayed for a couple days and left. And now since then, there have been 2 more renters in and out. One stayed for a night, one stayed for 3 nights and is still there. And my big concern is that the business owners of these rental properties don't have to live 100 feet from the door of somebody of a business that's encouraging tourism. And this tourism itself is spreading disease in our community, and it doesn't make me comfortable. And I don't think it's fair for people in my neighborhood to fear the business across their street while everyone's losing their jobs and getting salary cuts, while another business right next door isn't closing their doors. In fact, they're encouraging people from out of state to come through. So something just feels really wrong there. I know what it's staying in the house, but it's definitely not helping with the spread of disease in Wheat Ridge. And they've lowered the price of their business to keep making a buck during these tough times while, okay.
Your time has expired. Thank you very much for speaking with us tonight. Is there anyone wishing to speak whose last name begins with the letter U through Z? please speak and I will recognize you. Okay, is there anyone who hasn't had a chance, who hasn't spoken tonight, who would like to speak at this meeting from the public? A through Z. Hearing none, I'm going to close the citizens' right to speak portion of our meeting. So we will move to our agenda meeting tonight. Our first item is Grammy's Goodies, Enhanced Sales Tax Incentive Program and S-Step request. Mr. Goff, do you have a staff report on this?
We do,
I'm so
Mr.
sorry. I just, sorry.
Yes,
I
Ms.
just wanted to-
Noslerback?
Yeah, I don't think I got counted in as being present. I was trying to log in. I could
We-
hear you.
Thank you. We will let the record show that Ms. Noslerbeck has joined us and has been here for the whole meeting. Thank you. Mr. Goff.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Steve Ard, our Economic Development Manager, is on, and he'll give a presentation on the Grammys Goodies S-Step application.
Thank you, Mr. Ard.
Thank you very much, Mayor, members of the council, Mr. Goff, for that. Tonight, we come before you in the study session to request permission to move forward with, at some point in the future, holding a public hearing to award a S-Step, which stands for Enhanced Sales Tax Incentive Program, to a business located on Harlan Street, Grammy's Goodies at 4601 North Harlan Street. This rebate would be for 50% of their sales tax. Right now, it's 3.5 cents in the city, as you know. 0.5% of that is dedicated to the 2E fund. So of the S-Step, we have 3% that we could share back to the business. So we would share half of that, 3 cents, back with them for a maximum not to exceed $70,000. For those new council members who may not have ever been involved in an S-Step, let me explain that to you. It's in our code of laws, which allows us to create economic development in the city by enhancing and helping to grow sales tax producing businesses in the city, of which Grammy's Goodies is one of them, a fine Italian restaurant. What the program does is it looks back the previous 12 months prior to the application. So in this case, it would be all of 2019. They made the application in approximately December. So we would look back the previous 12 months, get a baseline, the average sales tax that was produced on a monthly basis from them. That sets our base. Then after we approve an agreement with them, any additional sales tax they generate above and beyond that base, we would rebate back 50% of them to that, or a maximum of $70,000. To kind of tell you a little bit about Grammy's Goodies, they've been in business for 17 years. From what I understand, they originally began just in outdoor sales. Villa Italia, they served at, serving their fine cookies and Italian food. And then 17 years ago, they opened a physical business. And in the last 5 years, they opened in the city of Wheat Ridge. Vicki Corder and her husband, Jeff. Vicki grew up in Wheat Ridge and graduated from Wheat Ridge High School, and they're raising their family currently in Wheat Ridge and have been operating an extremely successful business in our community. And then recently, some very good news happened. They were featured on Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives. And this, if you haven't seen this is a TV show that is on the Food Network. And it's pretty well proven once you're on that show, your business is going to double, triple over time. And they have really seen an influx in business over there. Plus just their natural growth in business. So Grammys would like, currently they operate out of 2,000 square feet and they seat about 25 people in their facility. They need to grow that site. So they have purchased a building which will attach to their current site on the south end, which is currently right now a patio. So that patio will turn into a sit-in dining area there. Most of the facility right now takes up the kitchen. So by adding this area right now from the 2,000 square feet, they currently have about 1,400 square feet as kitchen, 600 is dedicated to allowing people to sit down. So they're going to expand that area greatly to allow more customers to sit into that area. Vicki Corder should be on our line right now. Vicki, are you joining us?
Yes, I am, sir.
Fantastic. So Vicki is with us today, and Vicki kind of wants to tell you about her business and the need and why she would like to expand her facility and what the need is and what her request is from City Council. Vicki, I'm going to turn it over to you for a minute.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Mr. Mayor. I'm terrified. This is my first city council study session. We were on diners, drive-ins, and dives, and our business exploded right before then all of this craziness started. So we're in a holding pattern now and trying to hold on. But we're adding on so that we can seat more people. We lose when we're busy a lot of business because there's nowhere to sit down in the restaurant. And everyone loves to be in the restaurant. It's me, my husband, our kids. It's all family run. Like Steve said, I was raised in Wheat Ridge, graduated from Wheat Ridge High School, and we just love being here.
Great. So with that, if council provides direction to move forward with this, what would happen is there would have to be an agreement, an S-step agreement that would be drafted, reviewed by our city attorney. A public hearing and a future date would then be held to hear testimony for this. And it would allow us then to, for a period of 5 years, 50% of the enhanced sales tax to then be rebated back to the quarters on an annual basis. So we wouldn't cut a check every month. We'd wait till the end of the year, cut them a check, and we do that for a period of 5 years. With that, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them for you, council members.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Ard. Thank you, Ms. Corder, for being on with us tonight. I will open this up for questions from council. If you'd raise your hand, I will call on you. Ms. Dozeman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to ask what the current situation, like how that plays into this, and is there some sort of like contingency put in place for if the business were to not make it through COVID-19 or shortly thereafter?
Ms. Dozeman, let me start first from the city side. It would put it at no risk because it has to be an enhanced sales tax. So if perchance the business did not create any enhanced sales tax, they would not receive any revenues from us. So it is what they earn is what we rebate back to them.
Okay, thank you for clearing that up.
Thank you. Additional questions from council? Okay, there's not a lot of questions. Ms. Hoppy.
Seeing not a lot of questions or comments, I'm going to ask for consensus to move forward with drafting an S-step agreement for future consideration at a regular council meeting for the following reasons. Grammy's remodel and expansion project will increase sales and use tax revenue, maintain permanent employment in the city, create construction-related jobs and the economic activity they bring to the surrounding neighborhood, support a Wheat Ridge-based small business, and meet the goals of the city's comprehensive plan.
Do we have consensus to move forward with those objectives? We have consensus. So, Ms. Corder, looks like we will be bringing this to a formal city council meeting, and we'll see how the council votes at that time. But thank you very much for joining us tonight. Tell me how your restaurant is making out in COVID-19 world. Are you all open, doing any delivery and takeout?
We are doing delivery and takeout. We've kept all of our people on the payroll. We are at a break-even point and very grateful to be there.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you're still there and still working. I got to tell you, my one. I wasn't so happy that, 2 or 3 weeks ago, right after you'd been on the show, and I came down for lunch, and it was sort of too crowded to get in. So I know you need this. I know you need the space. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We appreciate it. And you will be hearing more from council on this action.
Thank you so much.
Go to agenda item number 2. This is short-term rentals. Mr. Goff, do we have a report on this one?
We do. Mr. Johnstone, I believe, is on. Yes, our Community Development Director, and Scott Cutler, a planner in our Community Development Department, will both present on this. Thank you.
Terrific. Mr. Johnstone, please continue.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, Mayor and Council, and thanks, Patrick. Scott Cutler is a planner in Community Development Department, and he's really been the point person on this. So depending on how deep a dive we want to do on the topic tonight, we'll certainly be leaning on his expertise and skill set. I do have a PowerPoint that I will be sharing here. It's looking good on my screen. How about for others?
I see it on my screen, so I'm going to assume that the rest of council has it up. So please continue.
Great, thank you, sir. Well, we're continuing the conversation tonight on short-term rentals, a topic that we've been talking about formally, at least with council, for a little more than a year. Our first formal study session with council was back in March of 2019. So tonight, a big part of our meeting tonight is really just to recognize the fact that we have 4 new council members and having gotten their kind of policy level feedback on this topic as well. But the goals for tonight is just kind of reach some clarity on what we all understand short-term rentals to be, confirm whether council wishes to proceed with an ordinance to regulate short-term rentals. That was direction that we got from the previous council back in October of last year, and we'll summarize what that direction was. That discussion in October did result in this fairly detailed term sheet. Council's direction was very helpful in that it was very thorough back in October. So that's really been the substance of what we've been working on and what was shared in the council packet that you have for this evening. And then obviously talk about next steps, timing, particularly in relation to the fact that we have this temporary moratorium on stays of 14 days or less in existing short-term rentals. So the existing municipal code doesn't specifically define short-term rentals. Generally, the industry, and we believe them to be something like the renting of all or a portion of a residential dwelling. Wouldn't necessarily have to be a house, could be apartment or a condo, for periods of less than 30 days and often significantly less than 30 days, as has been mentioned in previous public comments earlier in tonight's meeting. So Chapter 26, our zoning code, which establishes permitted and not permitted uses and special uses, has always been silent to the topic of short-term rentals. In general, the default position for uses that aren't listed in the use chart is that they're presumed not to be allowed. Frankly, the land use zoning use chart has probably not been substantively updated since at or near our incorporation. So while short-term rentals as kind of a concept and a business model had been around for quite a bit of time, I mean, in my experience, at least 25 years, but I think it's safe to say that it wasn't something that was contemplated as a use back whenever the land use chart was most recently fully reviewed. So we have made the determination several years ago that short-term rentals are in fact not permitted uses, but then of course we've not been actively enforcement of that without a real clear regulatory environment would be incredibly burdensome from a time standpoint in terms of being able to prove that someone was operating a short-term rental. Safe to say it's not sufficient to just go to a judge or a court and say, well, here's their Airbnb listing. You've got to have physical evidence that they're operating in that manner, and that would be a quite labor-intensive effort to prove up. So as I mentioned, we have been certainly monitoring the trend for several years. It certainly has continued to tick up in Wheat Ridge, like many other communities. Obviously, it's a much more popular trend in cities with stronger tourist businesses like the resorts or Denver, but it certainly exists here, and we have somewhere between 150 and 200 units.
I believe Ken's frozen up, is that?
Ken, do you hear us? Because we don't hear you.
And he's at City Hall. I'll give him a text.
Okay.
Hi, and this is Allie. I can run up and have him come down to my office. I'm docked into the system, so we'll just give him a minute. I'll be right back.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor, I just spoke to Ken Johnstone on the phone. He is running down to Allie's office.
Thank you. We'll just stay here on hold for a couple of more minutes and he will be down and join us again. I know we've had some issues with our internet connections at the city building. Is that right, Mr. Goff?
We have, yes.
Okay.
Mayor, this is Ali Shack. Ken's coming downstairs. We're just going to get this pulled up on my computer. If you could just give us a moment.
Okay, thank you. We're just waiting. Let us know when you've got it back up, or maybe we'll know when we see it.
Mr. Mayor, would you like me to move on with a couple updates while we're waiting?
If you've got something that a good time filler for a few minutes, go ahead.
I do. First of all, we just found out that Governor Polis just extended the stay-at-home order to April 26th. So it originally was April 11th, but sorry, Ms. Dozman, I see you shaking your head at that. Just found out a few minutes ago that stay-at-home order has been moved to April 26th. A couple other quick things. Happiness Gardens in Wheat Ridge, we were contemplating not letting any gardeners in the garden this year except for commercial gardeners. We got some pushback from the gardeners for good reason. And so we are going to open those gardens for the growing season this year to everybody, but with some strict rules in place. Really following what Denver Urban Gardens are doing and Golden and Lakewood, making sure that social distancing practices are in place, not sharing tools. So we will be opening up those plots for all gardeners this season. There may be not as much maintenance from the city until we get more seasonals on board, if we can do that at some point. We're not sure if we can do that. So there may be less service provided by the city, but the gardens will be open. Oh, looks like we're getting close. Ken and Ali, you ready?
Are you, thank you for that. Thank you for that report. Ken, are you back in the saddle and able to continue with your presentation?
Well, you tell me. I believe so.
Yes, we
Okay.
can.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Goff. Mr. Johnstone, please continue.
Okay, so help me here. Where did not sure where I cut off.
Start with staff has been monitoring the trend for several years.
Okay. So we have indeed, we have not been ignoring it, but we also knew that it would be, a big ask, a heavy lift to get regulations in place. And we're just kind of waiting for it to get to a certain point where we felt with council's direction that it was really just time to take action. So obviously we've taken those first steps. We got some good input at a March 2019 study session, and that really raised a lot of questions, both kind of regulatory and what an approach might be. So we sent out a survey to council shortly after that study session, assembled the data from those questions, and presented that to council in October of last year. And that was a much deeper dive into what the substance of a regulatory environment might look like. So council gave us quite a bit of detailed input at that time. We did also back in 2018 have some questions in our citizen survey and got kind of mixed results, I would guess, in terms of what it might look like to regulate short-term rentals in the city. So where we're at now, as I mentioned, we had that consensus from October, and Scott chiefly has been doing the work of looking at different manners in which we could regulate short-term rentals and adopt an ordinance that would allow and regulate short-term rentals. In the meantime, obviously right shortly thereafter, we have 4 new council members, which potentially changes the regulatory approach, or frankly, just the desire to potentially regulate short-term rentals. Our first really question to council back then and now is, whether you want to allow them, and if so, whether you want to regulate them. So that's kind of where we're at tonight. I think that's the feedback that we think is most important for us to get. We've characterized that approach that you gave us in the October meeting as kind of a good neighbor approach. In other words, allowing them fairly permissibly, but making sure that they're acting in good faith. And if they're not, to have a punitive environment whereby they could be fined or cited into court, or in fact, their ability to have a short-term rental could ultimately be suspended if they're not being a good neighbor. So really focused on good operators. We've taken that direction and really drafted that detailed term sheet that we included in your packet, which would be the really framework of an ordinance, should that be council's direction. So again, really tonight, just checking in with council, whether to proceed to allow short-term rentals, and if so, when. So that's really our first question for you all tonight.
Okay, why don't we go to the council screen if we're done with the slideshow?
There's some more slides, but can we? Okay, I mean, I wanted to have this discussion first before we potentially go into a little more detail. Okay. So I will open it up for counselors. I can't. Okay, yes, this is good. I will recognize Ms. Hoppy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you to staff for pulling together all those different pieces of information and desires on what it would look like in putting it into a term sheet. When we do get to the part with the different terms, I do have some stuff that that I would like to see if we can discuss possibly adding. I think the thing with short-term rentals is that I've had lots of conversations with people who don't care if we have them and don't care if we regulate them, and lots of conversations with people who don't want them at all, and then lots of conversations with people who are okay with them, but they want some sort of regulation. And so I think we're trying to get to a place where we can, all these circles can kind of converge into one place. So I think it's important that we do find some regulation for short-term rentals, and that we do define it and get it in our code. And we've had citizens asking us to work on this for a very long time. So where I stand, I would like us to continue down this road and find some good regulation that we can agree on.
Thank you. Additional discussion from council whether or not to regulate short-term rentals. Please raise your hand, Mr. Urban.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would agree that this is an area within the city that needs to be regulated. It is somewhat concerning that we don't have anybody on this study session that is either a short-term rental owner or someone who's reviewed these term sheet from that perspective and provided us any public comment on that. So I'm not sure if they were invited. I hadn't had any communication with them, but the previous iterations, we did have public testimony regarding this. So I'm not sure if we have any, if anybody's spoken to any of them regarding this most recent term sheet, but I have not. So I don't know if we need a consensus to move forward on the regulation piece, as Ken mentioned, that yes, we want to continue to regulate it, but I would put that forward.
Additional discussion. Ms. Hulteen and then Ms. Nosler-Beck.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just want to say that I'm in favor of moving forward with adopting a regulatory environment. And I really want to thank Mr. Johnstone and his staff. I think having been following this conversation, what was presented to us tonight, I think really reflects the input that we've gotten to date. And I was impressed with it. And I think it covers pretty much everything that I've heard from people. I have a couple of things when we get into the weeds on that maybe to discuss further, but I think we're headed in the right direction. And I agree, it's an issue in our community, and we have, when we come back online as a community, I know we have neighbors who are looking to this to be able to, know what direction to go with some of their economic planning. So encourage us to move forward and keep it going. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Hulteen. Recognizing Ms. Nosler-Beck.
Thanks, Mayor. I just am in support of regulating STRs in some way, and I'm looking forward to the discussion on it. I think that what happened last week with us moving forward with the moratorium is proof that we need some kind of regulation so that we know what we have to regulate and what that universe looks like, so that with the moratorium passing, it can be enforced, and we can have business owners who operate these STRs in compliance, which I think overarchingly in the conversations that I've had with both owners and with neighbors is that we all know that most owners will go into compliance on this stuff. So thanks.
Thank you. Additional discussion from council on this issue? Ms. Hutchinson.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, thank you, Mayor. I am for regulation of short-term rentals. I do know that Denver and Edgewater have regulated their short-term rental situation. I think they would be a good reference to look at so that we don't totally have to reinvent the wheel. It can get very deep. So I am for regulation if that's what we're just going to start with right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional discussion from council. Ms. Hoppy?
I think maybe I'll ask for consensus that we move forward in looking towards regulating short-term rentals and get that knocked out so we can move on.
Okay, it looks to me like we have consensus to move forward with regulation of short-term rental. Mr. Johnstone, why don't you take us back to where you'd like to go?
I would just make a comment or two back to those council comments. Thank you for those. Ms. Hutchinson, we certainly have looked at many other jurisdictions, and Scott has, I think, a working relationship with staff over at Denver in terms of, what has worked for them well, and in some cases what hasn't. So we are leaning on our other communities that have led the way on this topic. And then Mr. Urban, I appreciate your comment as well regarding, who else might be out there. And I think we've had at previous study sessions, several people participate, and hopefully if this moves forward, they'll choose to participate again. The one struggle that we have is, and not to make this sound horrible, but they're not operating legally, right? I mean, anyone who's called up and asked us over the last 4 or 5 years whether they're legal, we've told them they're not. So it's just, and then there's a lot of people who have called up and gotten the answer to that question and have chosen not to open a short-term rental because they heard from the city that they weren't allowed. So it's just hard to know how appropriately to engage that audience, just based on those conversations that we've had over the last several years. I would certainly encourage the people that are out there operating or that seek to operate in Wheat Ridge in the future, choose to participate as this moves forward through a public hearing process and likely another study session. So hopefully those folks re-engage and can have some substantive input. And now I'm going to share a screen again.
Thank you.
Okay. Oops. So I don't know to what extent council wants to get into this evening. This is just kind of a highlight of some of the direction that we got from the October study session. So again, that be a good neighbor approach that I spoke about previously, to definitely regulate them and definitely tax them. We do think it is legal to tax them subject to the lodger's tax, as well as license and registration fees to cover the city's hard costs in that regard. There was direction to allow both whole home short-term rentals as well as partial home with limitations. and a real focus on establishing mechanisms and processes for compliance and enforcement. Obviously, you're going to have to define a number of different terms. It's a fairly significant ordinance, and we need to be real thoughtful about implementation strategies, and would likely recommend that we reach out to a third-party group that could help support our implementation efforts. So that's just some highlights of what the regulatory framework looks like. And obviously, there's a lot more detail in the council memo. So I guess just, do we want to talk about this, or an alternative to next steps would just be, we'll continue on this track if it seems like it's generally on the right track, and would propose to get in front of council at a later date with a more substantive discussion of this in the study session environment. And obviously we could do that fairly quickly.
Well, I think your staff has done a lot of work on this term sheet. I'm sure the councilors would like to opine on some of that. So I think we ought to at least get a little feel for whether we're headed in the right direction there, and maybe there's some not to pursue and maybe others that we should be looking at. So before we leave the topic, I'd like to have a council be able to discuss that.
I should get out of this. Is this helpful?
You know, it is, what I can't see everybody if they want to, to recognize them to talk. So in that respect, it's better for me if we're working off of the notes in our package.
I will make it so.
So we have all our counselors online. Why don't we open the floor up to discussion, and then if we need to move back to the slides, we will. But otherwise, we'll sort of start taking it from there. Do I have anyone who would like to speak on this issue? Ms. Hoppy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Again, I appreciate all of the detail that's gone into this term sheet. And there were a few things that I would like to discuss if other people would, and see if we can find some consensus on maybe some of the other things I'd like to see in it. First and foremost, I don't believe that long-term renters should be considered an owner-occupied dwelling, and I don't think that they should be allowed to run an STR. And I also don't think there should be corporation ownership. So there are some things like Expedia and places like that that own short-term rentals, and I don't think that we should allow that. Again, I agree with Mr. Whitaker that we should have something much more significant for fines for not being in compliance. And I do actually think that we should have at least a 2-night minimum stay. I'll have to check back with Mr. Whitaker. He had said I didn't support that, but I do support that. Another couple of things I noticed were, I feel like they should have to notify the neighbors that they're running a short-term rental, and whether that's within 100 feet or 200 feet. But in that notification, they need to let.
You're frozen.
Sophie, we've lost your audio and your video feed is frozen. I don't know if you can hear us. Do we have a way to connect with Ms. Hoppy? Communicate that.
I'll text her right now.
Okay, text her right now. In the meantime, while we're waiting for Ms. Hoppy, we'll move to other counselors. Mr. Urban.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would agree with everything that Councilmember Hoppy was indicating regarding some additional terms, and 2-night minimum, I think, is an appropriate opportunity for people to get to know the city of Wheat Ridge. And as it relates to corporations, I think one of the reasons to be against corporations owning Airbnbs or short-term rentals in the city is that we want to make sure that who's ever renting those is either a resident of Wheat Ridge or has some connection to Wheat Ridge, because part of the benefit of having short-term rentals in our communities is it gives us the ability to showcase our community to others. And it's hard for a multinational corporation or an entity outside the city of Wheat Ridge to really give us that best shot at showcasing our community. And a resident of Wheat Ridge that owns a short-term rental will be more responsive to our neighbors and showcase our community better. So I think that that's critical. I think that Mr. Whitaker is, regardless of his position on short-term rentals, I think his expertise in the regulatory environment is critical for us here. And the information that he was providing regarding the ability to issue subpoenas and collect information from the owners of short-term rentals is an excellent tool that we need to be able to utilize. I think in other circumstances, based on how we've devised our regulatory framework for other areas, it's made it more difficult to collect information. And so that piece of advice, I think we should carry forward and try to figure out how to implement that. And the disciplinary tools of a cease and desist order and a summary suspension and letters of admonishment, I think are important and appropriate to utilize. And then as Councilmember Hoppe indicated with respect to the fines, we need to make sure the fines are substantial enough to draw on compliance. And first-time fines may not be as extensive as secondary or subsequent fines, but we need to kind of stay away from that day-by-day fine because it's going to be hard to calculate that. As far as the cap and the number in a neighborhood, I do continue to have a concern regarding the Disneyfication of a neighborhood where you have multiple Airbnbs in a neighborhood to where it no longer becomes a neighborhood, but it becomes a rented neighborhood in a short-term rental sense, not in a regular rental sense. So I would still ask us to consider some sort of cap or distancing requirement within short-term rentals. And then specifically as it relates to health and safety standards and our ability to enforce this most recent moratorium is difficult because we don't know who they are or where they are. And we need to work in concert with the Jeffco Public Health Department to figure out the best way to make sure that if a COVID-19 situation comes up again, that we have an ability to require a certain standard of cleaning of these units. I think that's important. And then notifying the neighbors is important, but also making sure we have a robust complaint process that someone can't just call up and say, I don't like the guy next door. You have to have a valid reason why you're complaining, and that we have a robust complaint process for the short-term rentals, and that there's a follow-up process on that. I understand that a lot of the short-term rental websites have a rating of both the customer and the host, and that I think works in the marketplace, but from a city perspective, that doesn't really tie into our complaint process. So we want to make sure that we have a good complaint process there. And I would agree with Councilmember Hoppe regarding long-term renters should not be allowed to maintain or manage the short-term rental. And I would go so far as to say that, and I remember a discussion we had previously regarding this, is that, this is my last point, is that we should allow residents of Wheat Ridge to have short-term rentals and have one additional one, but no others. So that I think would help with the cap and the distancing issue if we have residents that are allowed to rent out their primary residence and one additional one. That I think would be a natural cap and distancing scheme, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now recognize Mr. Stites.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm actually in pretty much almost 100% agreement. This is weird with Councilwoman Hoppe and Mr. Urban. My one question is, if we're not allowing corporations to own them, would it be allowed that, say, Corey Stites, DBA, an S Corp or something like that could own it, just not a multinational corporation owning millions of them or multiples of them? Is that right? Or
Mr. Urban?
Yeah.
Thank you. I would say that that's correct. I'm not looking to dictate how a resident of Wheat Ridge manages his business, his or her business, but it's to that end of trying to figure out the most legal way to allow residents of Wheat Ridge to continue to operate these without having mutual funds and multinational corporations coming in and Disneyfying our east side.
Okay, absolutely. In that case, I'm 100% in agreement. I think that we definitely do want to limit the amount of these, because if somebody is visiting Wheat Ridge, they want the Wheat Ridge experience. They don't want, like Mr. Urban said, they don't want the Disney version of that where you come in and you stay in a bunch of hotels or you stay in a place full of other tourists or whatever. So I'm in complete agreement with all of that. I think we're on the right track. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stites. I see that Ms. Hoppy has been able to rejoin us. Can you hear us okay? And you got a connection back. Why don't we return to you before we entertain any other counselors? So please continue, Ms. Hoppy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and actually thank you to Steve Art, who called me and put you guys on speakerphone while I was working on my my internet. So I got to hear what Councilmember Urban was saying, and I appreciate that the last thing that I wanted to discuss was caps, and it sounds like we have, sounds like everybody's kind of agrees to that. It's hard because, District 1, when you look at the map that was given to us in the past, has a lot of little red dots in it, meaning short-term rentals. And so our Judy and our district, it has the most STRs. And so I definitely want us to find, I know it's hard to figure out how to do that, but I definitely want us to figure out how to do something with caps. And if we are also getting things like, I agree, Councilmember Urban, if we're doing things like you can only have one whole home and one if you live in it, that'll help with the density of short-term rentals. And then also if we can get rid of some of the larger corporations like Expedia and those places, that'll also help with the density. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate you guys waiting, or I appreciate you guys having this discussion about these items. So thank you.
Thank you. Additional discussion with council. Please raise your hand, Ms. Hutchinson.
Thank you, Mayor. When I see good neighbor approach for short-term rentals, that doesn't work. There's no way to enforce that really, because what does that mean? Also, I am looking to where I believe that short-term rental should be owner occupied. And if somebody else has another place that they want to rent out, then that can be a long-term rental. So this is what Denver and Edgewater has done. I do believe in having caps in the neighborhoods, because having these around in the neighborhood is a business, and it does kind of take away from what the neighborhood would be if they weren't there. So it's just constant coming and going and traffic, and it's a safety issue for children on the block. So it's more than just a business. We have to look at the citizens who are living in these neighborhoods and how they affect them. And another thing I'm wondering is when staff is having their meetings, is there anybody from council that's going to be on those meetings, or is it just staff that's making all the decisions? Just wondering. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Goff, do you want to address that?
Yeah, can you clarify that, Ms. Hutchinson? What did you mean by that? What meetings? Oh, you're on mute again. There you go.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yep.
So when the staff has their meetings and they're going to be figuring this out, okay, looking at ordinances from different cities and different kinds of things, who is the staff? And does city council participate in those meetings, or no? You just get what the results are from the staff meetings?
No, of course not. Staff does the work behind the scenes, not behind the scenes, but internally, and then we bring it back to city council as we are tonight, and you have to approve the ordinance and the pieces of the ordinance. So that we're asking for your direction tonight on this list of items that's in your staff report. And if we get consensus on those, we'll put those in an ordinance form and bring it back, and City Council can look at it again and give us further direction or approve or deny it.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Additional discussion on this item, Ms. Hulteen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I agree with most everything that has been brought up. I thank Council Member Hoppy for bringing up the concern about long-term renters being able to do short-term rentals, because that kind of flies in the face of being able to hold parties accountable and being able to track it. So I strongly support that we do not allow that. I like the direction that previous council, part of existing council, gave last fall around allowing one owner-occupied and one non-owner-occupied license in the city. And I share that just because I know I travel and use Airbnb a lot, and my preference is always one where I can have the whole residence to myself. I just feel safer and it makes me feel more comfortable, and especially if I'm traveling with my son. So I think offering short-term rentals in the city that are, the ability for someone to rent the entire house is, I think, good for, going to attract the kind of people we'd like to see come into our city. Sorry, I'm looking at my notes here. That limitation to me also puts the constriction in place around concerns around corporations. I know that there are, some people, whether it's like, a couple or a partnership, that will put their house in an LLC or some equivalent. So I don't know if that's something that we would be able to still allow if it's not a national corporation, but limited liability corporations. I don't know if we'd have the ability to discern those differences. And then my question is, as far as enforcement goes, how would you compare what was proposed by Mr. Whitaker to how we enforce other business licenses in the city in terms of complying with our regulatory environment? And I'm thinking like liquor licenses or other type of things that we specifically license and regulate and enforce.
Mr. Johnstone or Mr. Goff, do you want to address that issue that Ms. Hulteen brought up?
Yeah, I'll start a little bit and turn it over to Ken, but we've been in conversations with organizations that help cities manage and enforce short-term rentals. One in particular is Host Compliance. They help many cities across the country, and they kind of have a large menu of services that they can provide to the city. You don't have to select everything, but they do have an enforcement model that they help cities actually enforce the licensing, actually even the behaviors in the short-term rentals. The last conversation we had with them is they can actually be the first line of enforcement if they get a complaint from the neighborhood that the short-term rental occupants are having a loud party. The Host Compliance is the one that makes the phone call and to the owner and the residents of that short-term rental. So there's quite a few tools out there that we can use, and also look at internal enforcement, that what we could do through our normal business licensing enforcement in our normal code enforcement tools that we have. I don't know if Ken, you have anything to add to that?
Just a couple things. We've been meeting internally with all city departments. Community development has taken the lead really in drafting these regulations, but ultimately the regulations, other than some minor changes in the zoning code, will live in Chapter 11, our licensing regulations. And so we've been working in lockstep with Allie's department to talk, to see some parallels there with how we handle business licenses. And then we've also been working closely with the police department, because ultimately, and we'll eventually need to involve the prosecuting attorney in court so that we can, and the city attorney's office, because we want to make sure that we have an ordinance that's enforceable and understand who's enforcing it, because ultimately community development will have a lesser role in the enforcement, and we want to make sure that the police department and the business licensing folks and our attorneys and our court are all kind of in lockstep as to what enforcement looks like if that's the approach that we want to take, which is to make sure these people are operating in a fashion that's good for the neighborhood.
Additional discussion from council, Ms. Nosler-Beck.
Thanks, Mayor. I had a question, and maybe a company like Host Compliance could help with it. I think it would be really great to look at communities, cities, towns that are similar to Wheat Ridge, maybe like a suburb of Portland or a suburb of Seattle or something like that, versus just to get some ideas on some potential regulations or creative ways that they're dealing with it. Because I find that when we're trying to be, if we're just looking to Edgewater or if we're looking to Denver for what they've done, we might be missing out on some of the creative ways that people have dealt with this, because we do have a different density in both of those municipalities. I just want to get a better grasp. These STRs have been around long enough that there's a lot of cities who have adopted this and dealt with the spillover. And I think if it's possible, especially if there's companies like Host Compliance out there, to look at some of these other municipalities that are dealing with it that way.
I'll make one comment and then maybe ask for a little help from Scott, but we've certainly looked much more broadly at other communities and not just in Colorado or on the Front Range. So we're taking that approach. So I appreciate that comment. And then specifically to Denver, I mean, I think there's aspects of Denver's ordinance that just aren't working really well. And I think we can learn from them as well. But Scott, maybe you could jump in with just some other communities that you're finding to be good reference points that are good models for a community like Wheat Ridge.
Sure. For those that I have not met before, I'm Scott Cutler.
We can't, Mr. Cutler, we can't hear you very well.
Hold on, let me.
Thank you.
Plug my headphones.
Can't hear you at all now.
Try it now.
Is that better?
Very much better.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'm Scott Cutler. I'm a planner in the Community Development Department. We have looked into a lot of different communities, some local, kind of starting with the Denver, Edgewater, Boulder. A lot of cities have their full ordinances online and actually have similar term sheets available, not only for the public, but for planners that are looking at the municipal code. So I've looked at kind of local communities, but also suburbs of Los Angeles and I believe some places in Texas, North Carolina. So kind of getting the full scoop from the large cities like Los Angeles, which has a really robust short-term rental ordinance, all the way down through cities like Salida that are much more localized and also much more tourist oriented. But I do like that suggestion of looking at kind of similar sized suburbs just to see. I think I found a few. We have found that kind of there are some cities that have taken the lead on this, and then a lot of cities like Wheat Ridge are really following up with ordinances well after the original people wrote the ordinances. So we can learn from cities like Denver that adopted an ordinance a few years ago now, because they probably did make some mistakes since they were one of the first to really have a robust ordinance, at least in Colorado.
Right. One of the things that I'm just trying to understand better. I mean, Wheat Ridge is pretty uniquely positioned in all of this because, we are the closest suburb to Denver. And then also if you're coming into town to go ski or you want to get up to the mountains for any reason, you're going to get up there. You're going to probably come into DIA and stay in Wheat Ridge for a night and then head up to the mountains. And I know that is how it works because I've got a lot of friends who have done that, and I think it's a good thing for Wheat Ridge if we kind of establish ourselves on the map as that. But I also want to make sure that we're being respectful, of our neighborhoods and keeping them the way we love them. So thanks, Scott.
Thank you. Additional discussion? Ms. Dozeman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I just wanted to discuss like the implementation and the advertisements of the STRs. Like we had mentioned that like it's a 21 plus age restriction for the primary STR renter, may not list as a party house or 420 friendly, and like dorm style rentals are prohibited, which means like a hostel, kind of like 2 people or multiple people in one room is my understanding of that, and the safety requirements. If this were to be advertised, sorry, I'm looking over at my other computer with my notes on it. If this were to be advertised, like how would the city address that? Like, would that be a violation that could be like put them on some sort of mandatory apps or mandatory time where they have to shut down, or like how would that be addressed?
Probably still working out some of the details on those, but the overall approach had been to say, if you have 3 violations, and we have to, double in the details on what is a violation, that could be cause for suspension of a license for some period of time or forever potentially. So that, that's kind of our approach in terms of how that would work at a high level. And yeah, it'll be important to understand with our city attorney how we write this in a manner that's very much enforceable.
Yeah, I think that's one of my biggest concerns is just enforcement. Like we've seen with the COVID-19 issue, because we don't regulate STRs, we didn't really have any enforcement mechanisms. And some of this, it seems pretty cut and dry, but how we are actually going to enforce it is really the question, because if we don't have any enforcement and we don't have really any teeth to that enforcement, then I don't see that we'll be doing anything differently than we are currently.
Thank you. Additional discussion from council? Mr. Urban.
I would just move forward a consensus to.
I'm not quite. If council's had a thing, I've got a couple of things that I wanted to go over before we move there. Just to drill down the details, you were requiring smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, fire extinguishers. In the last year, we've required new residences to have radon detectors. So a radon detector might be something that you might want to put in your list of things. And then Mr. Johnstone, can you sort of describe what you think about parking availability for STRs, either on-site or off-site? In your, how does your scheme look at parking?
I might defer to Scott on this. Generally, my recollection is if they're meeting their residential parking requirement, which varies a little bit depending on the type of residential unit and also the underlying zoning. And then we're asking them to provide 1 additional space for, in some cases, associated with the STR. And does that sound accurate, Scott?
Pretty much. So at least the way I wrote it is that it needs to meet the parking requirement for the zone district the home is currently in. So a single family home, for example, in R1 requires 4 parking spaces to be off street if there's no on-street parking available. So the owner of the property or the operator of the short-term rental would have to certify that that parking is available. And if they are planning on running a short-term rental where they don't have a driveway, for example, or they're a non-conforming property, then they at that stage would have to provide additional parking. But my impression is most homes in the city are compliant with their parking requirements for their zone district. So this may not be a big issue.
Thank you. And then I had one other question. If and I think it was sort of in the definition of the short-term rental, would it be possible for someone to have multiple contracts or multiple leases on a 29-day basis so that they weren't 30-day and long-term, they were sort of less than that? And does that cause an issue, or would that be something that we should concern ourselves with?
Yeah, it's a good question. The stuff is kind of tricky to define and get your arms around in some cases. I guess my comment on that would be, that is looking probably then more like a long-term rental. And we don't regulate long-term rentals in the city at all currently. So that might just end up being like a month-to-month lease on what effectively is a long-term rental.
Okay. That was my questions. Is there any other questions or discussion from council? Ms. Hulteen?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think that I'd wanted to make a couple more comments, but I remuted myself earlier, so my apologies. One thing that, considering the caps, I know that there's one block in particular that is concerned about having too much density around the existing short-term rentals. One thing I'm thinking about is we're all looking for, this time, hopefully at the appropriate time, and we're hoping it's not too far out when we come back online as a city and go back into operation. But I know a lot of our neighbors have been really economically impacted by this. And so I just want to be mindful about the fact that we haven't been enforcing short-term rentals, and there are a lot of neighbors that are looking to that short-term rental income either now or potentially in the future to help with whatever economic impacts they've had. So I hope we can come up with a regulatory environment that allows for, an appropriate type of regulation that allows us to keep our neighborhoods feeling like neighborhoods, but also allows our neighbors who own their homes to stay in them. And if short-term rental income is a way of helping them stay in our community, I think that that's an option that they should be able to have. So, and then the other thing I wanted to bring up, the 2-night minimum. I'm not sure I completely understand what the motivation is behind that. I've heard sort of like the Disneyification concern, and I'm not sure I understand what that means exactly. I know a lot of people, like Ms. Nosler-Beck was mentioning, will stay somewhere on their way up to the mountains for a night. So and I know that there's a lot of secondary businesses that do cleaning and services that, that increased turnover also benefits them. So I wouldn't mind hearing some more input on exactly why the concern around a 2-night minimum, so I can better understand it. Because I would prefer to not regulate that, but if there's good reasons for it, I'm open to hearing it. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional discussion. Ms. Hoppy.
I just wanted to put my 2 cents in on why I think a 2-night minimum is important. And part of it is because what is kind of happening with the 1 night is that they rent it for 1 night and there's a party. And so it's really just a 1-night party and they're coming from different areas, but also that it increases the traffic volume in the neighborhood. And so, several people that I've talked to have gone from, I don't want them at all, to, well, I just don't want that much traffic. So how can we minimize that much traffic of people coming in and out of our neighborhood? So that's why I support the 2-night minimum, is because I feel that it minimizes the traffic that's coming in and out of the community. And it also minimizes the opportunity for people to rent it for 1 night and have a big party and then, and then split. So that's why I support it.
Additional discussion, Mr. Urban.
One thing that I would add to that is the likelihood of a guest staying in a Wheat Ridge short-term rental for 1 night and not spending any money in our city is highly likely. But if they were here for 2 nights, they're more than likely going to be spending money in our local economy. And that's the primary reason that I'd like us to have a 2-night minimum, setting aside, I don't want Wheat Ridge to be known as a 1-night stand city.
Additional discussion. Are we ready for a consensus?
Mayor, could I just
yes, sir,
offer up some comments on Ms. Hulteen? Sure. Second to last comment there, in terms of the densification in certain blocks. We get it. I mean, we get why that becomes a concern as to, does it still feel like an established residential neighborhood? So don't want to set it aside. But at the same time, just want to acknowledge some practical challenges moving forward with that. We've anticipated that if we are going to roll out this regulatory environment, let's just say later this year, that we want everyone to have an equal playing field. And what I mean by that is, if we go out and say, okay, you've got 60 days to get registered, And we're saying that to existing short-term rentals that are out there and we know operating. But in my opinion, at least, we're also saying that to the other people on the block, that when we told them that they couldn't have one, that they were not legal, that they followed the rules and didn't establish one, but may still want to have one. So I feel like we need to go out when we say we're regulating short-term rentals and say you've got 60 days to get your license. And that could mean that on one block, you have to, if they come through and get the proper licensing, that you end up firming up a fairly dense population of short-term rentals on a certain block. So I just kind of want to acknowledge that's a challenge moving forward if we want to be, in my mind, equitable amongst existing operators and potential future operators. And then just one last thought on that topic, which is, I also get the logic or the desire to have a cap, whether that be a citywide cap of a certain percentage or some other mechanism, or the desire to have a separation requirement, which we already have for a number of different uses in the city. But when we talk about trying to manage that over time with potentially around 200 units and an ever-changing environment of who still is operating and isn't operating, and try and do that GIS buffer analysis on a fairly active basis, I just need you to know that we believe that could be a fairly time-intensive approach.
Mr. Johnstone, is that something that your consultants have the expertise, and have they told you whether that's a big deal or not to them? I mean, do they have the tools that would make that not a laborious effort?
They may.
We haven't asked that specific question, but I think that's something they might be able to help us with, so we can address that with them.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Are we ready for a consensus on this?
Could we, if we are going to get a consensus, can we make sure we break it down into actual points so that we have general good direction?
Okay, Ms. Hoppy?
Yeah, I would like to ask for consensus for staff to move forward with their term sheet as presented with some of the following changes, and I'll go one at a time in case we don't have consensus on each. So remove allowances for long-term renters to be STR owners.
If you're in favor of this, please raise your hand.
So long-term renters.
Okay, so
Can you repeat that?
Yes. Remove the allowance for long-term renters to be able to be short STR operators.
So this would mean that it would only be applicable to the homeowner?
Yes.
So homeowner only. Looks like we have consensus there.
I'm going to say no corporation ownership, and maybe ask for staff to move forward knowing that the intent is not to leave out Janice and Joshua LLC, that's my brother, by the way, but Expedia, so I'll ask for consensus for no corporations with kind of that idea.
We have consensus on that.
I'm going to ask for consensus to utilize more of a fine authority with an up to and a significant amount to be more strict on the fines.
More strict fines and greater fines. We have consensus on that.
I'm going to ask for a requirement to be added to notice the neighborhood, to send notice to the neighborhood within 150 feet, and in letting them know that they are operating an STR within 150 feet of them, and also letting them know who the emergency contact is on file.
Consensus on notification. We have consensus on that.
So long as it's 360 degrees around, so we're not dealing with the issue we had with catty corner type notification, that it's all the way around.
Okay, so that's a robust notification.
I'm going to ask for, and this one we'll probably have to count out, I'm going to ask that we require a 2-night stay.
All those in favor of a 2-night stay? 1, 2, 3.
Minimum, of course.
Or a minimum?
Minimum, sorry, yeah.
A minimum 2-night stay. Put your hand up and leave it up. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have 5 in favor of that. So that is a consensus at this point.
And then I'm going to ask that staff potentially look towards finding caps for after the initial 60-day registration or whatever the initial registration time you have to register, and that they find a way to try to measure that, whether it's per district, per mileage, for the city as a whole, and leave that open for them to try to come up with some way to do caps.
Okay, so some way to cap this, and it looks like we have a consensus on that.
Can I ask for a clarification first?
You may, please ask, Ms. Holteen.
Ms. Harvey, can you just clarify? I just want to make sure I understand your statement. So we would be looking to come up with a capping system for after the first coming into compliance, licensing, registration. So after we get through that, then we would be looking at a capping mechanism for after that.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I just want to thank you.
And that's all I have for that consensus.
Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Urban?
Thank you. Depending on how the city attorney and staff is able to devise the regulatory scheme, I'd like to make sure that we have a robust subpoena process and ability to obtain information from the owners as we go through the regulatory process. I don't know if that would need a consensus or if that's going to come as an organic part of the regulatory process. I'll defer to staff to ask if that's necessary.
So, Mr. Dahl, we're able to create a scheme that that has a regulatory process to it that is lawful and robust.
Certainly, there's no problem doing that. Both before and after, there would be a citation in a municipal court. Subpoena would be something that we ask the court to issue if there were an enforcement case that went as far as a municipal court violation. But previous to that, before filing a violation of municipal court, certainly would be able to have records requests satisfied, and the code could certainly require that they produce records upon request by the administrative officials in preparation for any kind of enforcement action or administrative hearing. So I'm confident we can have a robust enforcement process undergirded with the ability to get the relevant documents.
Okay. And in addition to that, talking about cease and desist or some summary suspension of their license or a letter of admonishment leading up to that issue we talked about of 3 strikes and you're out, devising that sort of type of regulatory scheme where we can sort of mark in the, a line in the sand to say you've had 3 distinct strikes and now we're going to, ban you from operating. Is that reasonable?
Certainly, those are all administrative remedies that take place really pretty swiftly as compared with a court remedy. So that it would be no problem for us to include that. We may or may not choose to rely upon the administrative enforcement process that we have for a lot of code provisions that you might recall. That's an opportunity for us as well to have pretty swift, informal but effective administrative enforcement.
Okay. And then the only other sort of regulatory aspect of this that I'm not sure, again, I don't think we need a consensus on this, but regarding the Jefferson County Public Health Department and cleaning requirements and that they be similar or exceeding that of hotels. I don't know if there's any regulatory framework around the cleaning of hotels, but at least, we talked about fire extinguishers, smoke detectors and the like, but we want to make sure that they are also adhering to CDC standards with respect to public accommodations.
No problem with providing in the ordinance that those are standards, just like smoke detectors and fire extinguishers are pretty commonly shown as required in other short-term rental ordinances that I've seen and written. No problem with requiring those standards, understanding that Jefferson County Public Health is probably in a better position to know if those standards have been met or not. We can certainly reference them in our code, but our local staff ability to know if they've been met or not is more limited.
Yeah, and I wouldn't ask our staff to be in that position, but maybe tying the public health department in on this so that they are at least aware this is what we're doing, and we'd like them to be that arm on that aspect of it.
We can certainly refer to that. You know, the city doesn't have power to expand the jurisdiction of Jefferson County Public Health, or more accurately, to compel them to perform enforcement on a case-by-case basis. Having said that, we work closely with them and have a relationship with them, and I would expect that the city would rely on that relationship.
Thank you. That sounds good.
And
Mr. Johnstone? Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Urban, did you have?
Sorry. And I don't know if this was covered previously when we talked about the corporation ownership of it, but specifically asking about the previous council had sort of come to this conclusion regarding that there is one, that Wheat Ridge residents can own one in addition to their primary residence. So that would be a cap of 2 for residents of Wheat Ridge to own short-term rentals. Was that fleshed out?
I believe that's already in the memo, Council Member Urban. I believe I read it that way, but then they also had the long-term renter, which we took that part out.
Okay, thank you.
And I make sure I'm clear on that because I've been a little confused. So Wheat Ridge resident has a home that they rent. They can rent out the one they occupy, they can rent out a room. And then if they own another house, they can rent out the whole house. Is that, or they can rent out the whole house that they live in also, and also the whole house that the second property they own, or do you guys care about that?
Ms. Hoppy?
The way that we have discussed it in the past is that one owner occupied and one non-owner occupied is how it should be defined.
But with the owner occupied, can they only rent rooms or can they rent the whole house? Because they might go on vacation and rent the whole house.
No, they can only rent rooms.
Patrick, I can respond to that. So the intent, and it's the second sub bullet, or I guess the first bullet point in the allowances and logistics section. So it's a short-term rental host can operate on up to one non-owner occupied dwelling unit short-term rental, in addition to one owner occupied dwelling unit where they may rent rooms but must still live on site.
Okay, gotcha. So I want to make sure everybody understood that.
Yeah.
Mr. Urban, did that solve your question, or do you have another question? Or
no, I just wanted to make sure that
okay.
That we didn't need a consensus on that we already have that.
Good. I want to go to Ms. Hulteen, and then hopefully we're wrapping this one up.
Thank you. I just have a point of clarification. So are we only allowing Wheat Ridge residents to rent out short-term rentals? So if I were to say, take a 3-month sabbatical and go live on a beach in Australia, I wouldn't be able to rent my short-term rental out because I wasn't a resident of Wheat Ridge at the time. I'm just confused about who we're licensing. Do they have to actually live in Wheat Ridge to get a license, or can they live in Edgewater or Lakewood or somewhere else? Clarification would be helpful. Thank you.
Can someone address that, Ms. Hoppy?
I just would say in the terms that we've been presented, that we asked for consensus to move forward, it does not require you to have to live in Wheat Ridge to have your non-owner occupied short-term rental.
Thank you.
Ms. Dozeman.
So if we're going to be allowing people outside of our community to have short-term rentals, are we going to then implement some sort of regulation as far as like you have to be within a certain distance or be able to address issues within a certain amount of time.
I can respond to that if that's okay. So that was also included in the memo. I believe it was a 24-hour phone number is required to be posted, and then the host has to be able to respond to the property within an hour. That's in the compliance and enforcement section. So that means that if someone does own property, but they don't live in Wheat Ridge, they would still have to be able to respond, or their contact would have to be able to respond within an hour. And that's a 24-hour emergency contact info. And I believe that was consensus from the last study session in October.
Ms. Weaver, you need to unmute.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I was just curious, is it only responding within an hour? Because I actually, in the previous session, I'm for someone being able to be on site at the property within an hour. Because I think that is very key to an owner being able, or whoever that emergency contact is, that person live within a certain amount of miles. That was my experience up in Grand County, that either the emergency contact had to live within, I think they said 45 miles or something like that. So I was just curious if other people would support the addition of not just respond within an hour, but live within a certain amount of mileage, so that a person could the contact or the owner, it doesn't have to be the owner, but a person who is designated the emergency contact can physically be at the property. Thank you.
And that's actually what's in the term sheet. It says respond to property within an hour.
Oh,
so
thank you. Okay.
Respond in kind of shorthand, but that's what's meant by that, is they can actually physically be there.
Awesome. Thank you for clarifying that.
To be there. Are there any other issues to resolve on agenda item number 2? Okay, we will conclude agenda item number 2. I'd like to take about a 10-minute break right now. So I'm going to recess, and we will come back together in 10 minutes. Should be about 8:28, something like that. Okay? noses whenever everyone keeps moving around on the screen, but I think we're all back. Thank you very much. Let's reconvene our meeting, and we will reconvene with item numbers 3. This is a staff report, subparagraph A, Wheat Ridge Small Business Sustainability Program. So, Mr. Goff, do you want to start us off on this one?
Yeah, we just wanted to give you an update. We have Steve Art here with us too. We received direction from City Council at the last meeting to, well, first of all, City Council approved $250,000 for some type of business program, recovery program, or business, what we're calling stabilization program. We also received direction to go ahead and put criteria together for such a program and get it implemented. So we've been working on that. Steve's been working with our different business groups, and I will turn it over to him and let him give you an update of where we're at.
Thank you very much, Patrick. So the program, we have been working diligently over the last week to formulate a program where we can distribute equitably $250,000 to our businesses. So the first decision that we would like to recommend is that we do this as a grant and not a loan program. A loan program is just so hard to administer, especially on the back end when we start receiving funds in. We thought the easiest way to get these out would be to grant these to businesses. And the eligibility to get these would be that you need to be a for-profit, independently owned business with a storefront in the city of Wheat Ridge, and franchises are not available for this grant. We did a survey out of local businesses, specifically restaurants, because those are the ones that are greatly impacted, about full-time employment. So we limited the program to 25 employees or less. You have to obviously have a City of Wheat Ridge business license and in operation since January 1st of 2020. We have an application. It will be an online application that you apply to, so there will be no printing out, emailing. It's all done via the web portal on our website. You fill out the application, and within the application, we allow you to demonstrate how you've been affected by COVID-19, such as a loss in revenue, having to lay off employees. What can the money be used for? That was a tricky part. How do you track it that it's obviously going to be used for what you intended to be done? And at this point, it's going to have to be on an honor system by our businesses. But we want them to use it for the operational needs, to pay employees, to pay their rent, to pay their mortgage, to buy supplies they need to keep their business sustainable. We're going to only allow one grant per business. They have to be in good standing with the city, which means no outstanding issues, no liens, no city judgments against them. We'd also have been encouraging businesses over this last week to access the federal programs that are out there. Specifically, Zach, you were on that call with us with the Senator Gardner earlier on this week, talked about the payroll protection plan. We are certainly encouraging our businesses to apply that. I probably have sent out 100 emails over the last couple of days telling our businesses how they can access those programs. So that will be the criteria, the eligibility to get into the program. The approval process. So I have reached out to the Wheat Ridge Chamber, the Wheat Ridge Business Association, the Wheat Ridge Business District Association, Chamber, and Local Works, and each one of them. I'm waiting for the Chamber. Dominic and I have been playing phone tag, but each one of those organizations have identified one person to be on this task force. Our treasurer, city treasurer, Chris Miller, is going to sit on this task force, and I will represent City Hall. What we are planning to do right now is at some point in the future, we will open up the application process for X amount of days. Maybe that's 5 days, 7 days. They will open up the application process, accept all those applications in. Once those applications are accepted, we'll close the process, and we'll take all those applications and we'll pretty much throw all the names into a hat and randomly beginning pulling them out one by one, making sure that they have completed their application correctly, that there really is a need for our assistance. And if so, we'll just keep funding those one at a time until we reach the $250,000 that you have allocated for that. We hope to have the funding decisions within 10 days after we close that process. We think we can work through that pretty easily. And then once we approve those businesses to be funded, It would take probably about 1 week of approval. I did email our finance manager today, Mark Colvin, asking what the best method is. If these people have direct deposit, that is the best way that we can deposit that money instantly into their account. One of the questions that Patrick and I would like to ask of you tonight is, we can work this program a number of different ways. We could give out, $50,000 grants and give it to, 5 businesses. We can do $10,000 grants and do 25 businesses. Our recommendation has been that probably to be the most assistance and help the biggest number of businesses, that we offer $5,000 grants. We can assist 50 businesses there. If you drop it down to $1,000, you can assist 250 businesses, but is $1,000 really going to make that much of a difference? So we thought $5,000 would probably be the biggest effect that we can have on there. Again, the only way that you can apply for this program is via that web portal. It will be open. Hopefully it will work error-free when we get on there. And then we get those businesses funded and we assist them. And just to let you know, in the meantime, for those businesses that haven't been funded, you as City Council have asked us to reach out to our businesses. For our restaurants in town, we have provided all of our mom and pop owned businesses in town all a sign that says they're open for takeout. For those that are open for takeout, we've encouraged them to access the state and the federal programs. We're reaching out to them on a daily basis to help assist them in any way we can. Mr. Goff, you have any more comments on the program?
Also, I think we were looking for participation from maybe at least one council member that wants to be on the committee also. I think Mr. Urban was shaking his head. I think that might have been recommended
Thank you.
In addition to our city treasurer. So we'd like that to get that name this evening also.
Thank you. We'll go to questions from council now. Ms. Hulteen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have a couple of questions. First, the 25 full-time equivalent employee eligibility requirement, are you looking at historically 25 employees or currently employing 25 people? Was that discussed?
Historically.
Okay. And then one thing, so having to demonstrate that they've been impacted by the hardship of the COVID-19 situation, if their business opened on January 1st, is that going to be hard for them to kind of show with just only a couple months of operation? Maybe.
Yes. Yeah, that may be, but boy, we just want to make sure it's not a business that says, boy, I had to take all my employees and they're now working out of home. Right. I have been impacted by, well, they really haven't been impacted. They're still earning revenues. They're just employees are working out of home. We're just trying to decide, define those that have really been impacted by, I've had to lay off people, my business is not as active as it was. Is it going to be a hit and miss on this? Probably so. We're trying to roll this out in 7 days' time.
Okay, and then my last question, first of all, I meant to open, I'm so grateful you guys have done this quickly and thoroughly, and I think time is of the essence, and I really appreciate in here specifically that you mentioned how quickly you're going to turn the applications around. I think that's critical. I am a little bit concerned when you're saying you're just going to start pulling names out of a hat, and if my name doesn't get, I'm not applying, but that kind of somewhat randomness feels a little bit uncomfortable to me. Is there a way that we could look at some sort of ranking or hierarchical and maybe kind of looking at aligning the grant maximum based on operating budget or how many employees they have? Is there some sort of scale that we could use and say some businesses maybe are eligible for 3,000 and others for 5 and others for 7? Because I know the overhead of a small business is very different than say Eugene over at Colorado Plus. So I don't know if there's a more equitable way of looking at that maximum eligibility. I'd be curious for any thoughts on that. Thank you.
So it's kind of two parts of that question right now. 5,000 would be our maximum. We were thinking certainly a business that maybe only has 1 employee and just needs $1,000, 2,000. We can certainly do that. The thing I've been struggling with over the last week is how to make this equitable. Should it be first come, first served? That's tough to do. do you take all your applicants and divide them up, and then you're randomly making a decision on who's important and not important? So today, we just kind of arrived at the notion of we're just going to make it random. We're going to put the names in the hat, and some will get funded and some won't. But potentially, if we open it 2 lines, if we get 1,000 applications in that time, and you want to get money out in the next 10 days, it's going to be very difficult for us to analyze applications.
Steve explained that a little bit more. I wasn't part of that discussion, Rachel, but Steve just told me today, I think he met with some of the business association folks, and that was what they suggested. Because if we get 10,000 applications, we can't fund everybody. But I think, Steve, it's not just pulling them out of a hat, right? You're going to make sure you're going to go through the applications and see who's eligible.
Correct.
And then, but I think what Rachel is saying, well, should this committee look at which ones are in the most need, maybe, or which ones would have the biggest impact on the city's future? I think that's something the committee could consider if that's what council wants them to do. I think it does make it more complicated, but if you want to put more specific criteria, so you're evaluating each application on need, actual true need. I'm not sure what the rest of the council feels on that.
I had Mr. Urban next, and then Ms. Nosler back. Mr. Urban.
I don't think none of these decisions are going to be easy, and I would agree that we need to try to figure out the most equitable way to do this. And no matter how we put this out or roll this out, someone's going to be jilted or upset about how we did it. But one of my concerns is if we have a one-man shop that gets $5,000 and a restaurant that's been in business for 50 years doesn't get anything, those are, that may not seem equitable to some folks. And so that's one of my concerns, is that if you have a one-man shop, I just don't see how we can give them the same amount of money that someone who has 50 employees needs. So I would like to see it so that we have it be a lower limit of number of employees. So if you have 2 employees or more, as opposed to an LLC that has an office that gets gets funding, but a team of 50 people doesn't. And I guess the number of employees limit, why was it limited to 25 employees?
Sure. I think just to keep it, again, it's somewhat of a random number, but Steve did check with our businesses to see kind of what that upper limit is for most of our small businesses. So it's helping our small businesses. We think any larger businesses have maybe more capacity to find other resources, not necessarily all of them, but needs to be a cutoff probably at some point. Some of the federal funds are, of course, it's a much larger number. 500 employees, I think, is where they cut it, but those are much larger numbers. So I think we think most of our small businesses are 25 employees or less, I think is kind of what the number came from.
And to that point, one of the databases that I've used in the past is Reference USA, and it does have a column in there on the database as it relates to the number of employees, and we could look at that and say, based on this criteria, the average number of employees is X, and go from there. Mm-hmm. 25 does seem somewhat arbitrary. I would agree that sounds about right, but if someone could present us with an argument as to why they, it could be some kind of point system where if someone has a larger number, they just might not score as well as others. And if we're talking about pulling them out of the hat and we scored them, we could score them in 3 different categories and start with the first category and go from there.
I think it sounds like we have a good chairperson for this committee that could maybe help put together a program, and so the council doesn't have to get in the weeds. Steve's put together a pretty good committee, I think, of people other folks that have given grants out. I think Chelsea Bunker is with the Wheat Ridge Business District. Is Kate Cook from Local Works? She's got experience with this. I think the committee could, and Tom Ripp is on this too, Steve, right?
Correct, those are right. And Wayne, someone from the chamber would be the next.
Yeah, local attorney. And I think all these folks don't have really an interest in the grant program for themselves, which is good. And they would be unbiased. And I think they could come up with a good program to distribute these funds in an equitable manner.
Thank you. I have Ms. Nosler-Beck, Ms. Hoppy, and Ms. Dozman. Ms. Nosler-Beck first.
Thanks. I wanted to just throw out that potential criteria that I've seen used in other communities as they're in recovery, was that they would try to offset the federal grants. So the criteria would be for the businesses that don't have a shot at qualifying for the federal dollars. And that would be like one of the ways that you would prioritize. So that's one idea that I've seen before. The other is that you try to make the application process very similar to what the federal application process would potentially be, so that for the business owner who is already in distress, filling out their forms, they aren't having to do it one way for the city and another way for the federal government and the state and the county. And it's just something that we can do to help assist our business owners that are potentially going through this, is just try to make it a process that's consistent across the board. So those are just two ideas I wanted to throw out. And then also, I think that kind of to what Councilmember Urban was talking about, just the threshold of 25 employees with storefronts. Like how many do we just have in Wheat Ridge? Do we have that number so we can anticipate the number of applications that we would potentially get based off of that number? That was my question.
We don't have that number.
I think we have the ones that were directly impacted by the public health order, the restaurants and bars, and I think Zach even pulled up some businesses. I think it was 225 or something around there, Zach.
I think it was 242, the number that I had, and that was again the Reference USA database that you can access through your local library card, and you can sort it by restaurant code or by various industry codes and be able to come up with numbers on that. But I think it was, and the 242 included gymnasiums, tattoo parlors, spas, nail salons, and the like. So it was specific to the criteria listed in that health order.
Thank you. I have Ms. Hoppy next.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I'd just like to say thank you to Steve and Patrick Goff for really running real quick with this and getting it pulled together in the 1 week. I agree. If we're feeling like grants is the right way to go, I agree with that. And I do understand that we're trying to find like kind of our smaller, our micro businesses that don't necessarily won't necessarily get much help in the through like the SBA loans and stuff like that. But I appreciate all the work that's gone into this. What I would really like to do though is officially ask Councilmember Urban to be a part of this committee. And if necessary, I'll make a consensus for that later. But so I would just really appreciate if Councilmember Urban, he had said several times the last time we talked about this that he would be willing to do it. And so if he's still willing to do it, I'd like to ask him to do that. And then after we have this conversation, I have a quick question about Biz Ridge.
Thank you. I have Ms. Dozman next and Mr. Stites in the queue.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to make the comment that since we've already established a committee, I think that kind of judging the criteria and basing it off of the most need or the most impact, whether that's on a business or our community, I don't think that would necessarily be too difficult, especially since it sounds like there's a really good group of people that's going to be on this committee and they have good judgment and have served the community in various capacities. So I just wanted to throw that out there that I don't think, ensuring that they fit a certain criteria and then randomizing and picking at will that's necessarily the best process. I definitely think that judging, or I guess analyzing it and seeing how that would best fit with our businesses and the city as well, and just kind of take that into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dozman. Mr. Stites.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And thank you, staff and all the business owners and leaders who've stepped up to help out so far. I would agree that I don't necessarily like the randomness of this. I think that there's too many people that have been hit too hard to, and I do agree, maybe once you get to a certain point, once everybody's hit a certain criteria, maybe you have to make it a little bit random. But and I would also like to say that I would rather see some people walk away with some $2,000 and $3,000 grants than just doing $5,000 grants across the board. I would rather see, just speaking as a small business owner, $3,000, $2,000 would help quite a bit when you're trying to pay an employee or make rent or whatever it is for the next couple of months. So I would just prefer that we don't limit it to 5,000 and then saying, sorry, you're out of luck to the other businesses if we can. So, and I would also second or third that Zach would be a great chairperson for this.
Thank you. Additional discussion from council? Mr. Urban?
Thank you. I just want to make sure that as we look at the committee members on this, that appreciate everybody being willing to serve on that you've mentioned so far, but just wanted to confirm on the outset that none of those members would be applying for this, so that because we're shying away from the randomness, we're going to be picking winners and losers. And so we want to make sure that it's clear that that committee is without bias and that we don't have a dog in the fight, that we are doing the best we can with the limited resources that we have. And it'll make it a lot easier if we are ensuring that by serving on this, you are not, applying or accepting this grant.
Steve, do you know if that was the expectation for the ones that are on?
Yeah, and at this point, the only one who would technically be eligible would be Tom Ripp, and I can't imagine he'd apply for it. Kate Cook, she isn't eligible for it. Chelsea Bunker is not eligible for it. I don't know who the chamber rep is. Chris obviously is not eligible.
Right. Okay. Just putting that out there so we're clear. And when we move away from the randomness of this, it does put us into a position of, again, picking who's going to, it's important to know that this is what we have available right now. We might, when we were on that, when Steve Art and I were on that call with Corey Gardner and discussing the federal resources, the question that I asked of him was, what reimbursements can the city expect as it relates to our doling out of this $250,000? And he indicated that he's hopeful that additional monies will come to support the local municipalities. And while that hasn't come forward, there's an expectation of additional stimulus packages, and local governments are slated to be in a subsequent package. And so that isn't guaranteed, but we just want to make sure that we do what we can to get reimbursed if we're able to down the road.
Thank you. Additional discussion? Are we, Ms. Hobby?
If there isn't any additional discussion, then I would just like to make a consensus that we move forward with the small business sustainability program with all of the additional comments from council that we've discussed, and ask for Councilmember Urban to be the city council representative in the committee.
Thank you. Do we have consensus on that? Show of hands.
Yes, all.
I'm glad
Okay.
you consented.
Signed and sealed. It's too late now. Okay. Thank you all very much. Good discussion. Thank you, staff, for bringing this forward.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Council. Zach, I'll be contacting you immediately.
Okay,
Wait,
this
last
will, that concludes agenda item number 3. We will now go to agenda item number 4. This is elected officials reports, and we will start with subparagraph A, which is citizen engagement opportunities for official public hearings during the Colorado stay-at-home public health order. Mr. Goff, do you want to give us a send-off on this?
Yeah, I'll tee it up. There was a request from a few council members to add this to tonight's agenda for discussion. And as you all know, with study session agendas, we don't take public comment unless there's an actual item on the agenda. So we put it on the agenda at the very last minute. No backup materials, but we do have some information we'd like to share with you this evening. And I think we did receive, obviously at the beginning of the meeting, we received a few comments. And then I think there was a couple on Wheat Ridge Speaks. You should have all received those. But Allie Scheck is on the line still, I hope. And I'd ask her to give a breakdown of what we've been doing. Staff has really been doing a really great job of putting together some education and training and different opportunities for the public to continue to engage and participate in public hearings. And honestly, I believe there's more opportunities today than there ever has been. And we do have a video, our videographer and Allie put together that we'd like, I think it's already rolled out, Allie, I think I saw on Facebook, that educates and our residents on how they can participate. So Mayor, do you want to go straight to Allie and give you a rundown on what we're doing first?
If you're completed, I'd love to go to Ms. Scheck. Please continue.
Okay.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Allie Scheck. Yeah, so there's just a couple of notes, and then we'd actually like to play the video for you. It's very short, if that would be okay. But we definitely heard the great conversation at the last City Council meeting, and so we put together an internal team to work on a few different things. So tomorrow and on Thursday, so tomorrow at 10 a.m. and Thursday at 4 p.m., we are hosting 2 live mock City Council meetings. And we got a little creative with it. So we're really hoping that folks join in. So tomorrow's 10 a.m. is all about fitness. And we're going to, the mayor and the city clerk have agreed to join in. They're going to chair the meeting, and we've got some pretend city councilors. And tomorrow we're going to have a rezoning. We're going to do citizens' right to speak and invite folks. We want everyone that dials in to at least say who they are and how long they've lived in Wheat Ridge, just to practice, dialing in or zooming in, unmuting, and letting their voice be heard, and sort of tell us, how long they've been here. And then we're going to have I have an ordinance, a rezoning to rezone City Hall into a water park. So there'll be hopefully some public comment and a vote on that. And then we have 3 fitness staff that have produced these great videos, and they're also going to be on to educate the public about how to stay fit at home during this time. So we're hoping to sort of accomplish a different thing, a couple different things, and reach out to some different audiences. And then the one on Thursday at 4 o'clock is about gardening and similar structure. So those are 2 opportunities, and depending on how that goes, we'll add more. We definitely want to give people that practice. As we've talked about, you can Zoom in, you can call in, and you can comment on Wheat Ridge Speaks. And then of course we stream our meetings live on YouTube Live, Channel 8, and as well on Wheat Ridge Speaks. And so then the other thing we did is Jesse Johnson, who's the man behind the scenes, has put together an amazing video very quickly, and it features his wife and his dog. And if everybody could mute their mics so we don't have any feedback. Jesse, are you ready to roll?
Yep.
Great.
To help slow the spread of the COVID-19 virus, Wheat Ridge City Council and Planning Commission will meet virtually via Zoom to make sure important city business continues to get done. It's never been easier for you to participate in city council or planning commission meetings. In fact, there are 3 ways for you to weigh in on city business and make your voice heard. One way to participate in a public meeting is to dial in using your phone. Find the phone number and access code on the top of the meeting agenda or on the calendar appointment on the city's website. You will first dial the phone number and then be prompted to enter the access code. You will then be able to hear the meeting. In the case of a city council meeting, the mayor will invite participants to join in the public comment portion during citizens' right to speak, and you will be unmuted. He will invite participants to speak by last name. So when asked if anyone on the phone would like to speak, please speak up to be heard. The second way to participate in a public meeting is to Zoom in using your phone, tablet, or computer. For this option, you need to have a working microphone so that you can be heard. Click on the meeting web link on the top of the meeting agenda or on the calendar appointment on the city's website. When you click on the link, it will ask to launch Zoom, the city's virtual meeting platform. You will be asked to enter your name unless you've used Zoom before. You will then enter the meeting as an attendee, which means you will not be seen on camera. You will be able to view the meeting participants, such as the council or planning commission members, and you will be unmuted. If you'd like to participate and provide public comment, please speak up to be heard when the meeting chair, for example, the mayor, asks if anyone would like to speak. The third way to participate in a city council or planning commission meeting is to log on to www.wheatridgespeaks.org and comment on citizens' right to speak or a specific agenda item by noon on the day of the meeting for city council or by noon the day before the meeting for planning commission. There is no login information. Simply click on the item and type your comment. Remember, if you want to watch a meeting but not participate, you can view City Council and Planning Commission meetings from the link to YouTube Live on the city's website from Channel 8 or at www.wheatridgespeaks.org. Remember, participating in City Council and Planning Commission meetings has never been easier, and we encourage you to get involved from the comfort and safety of your home. Thank you for participating in your city government.
That's awesome, Jesse and Allie.
Thank you. Yeah, great video. Thank you very much.
That's all, Jesse.
Good job, Jesse.
Okay, then then we will open it up for questions or comments from council. Mr. Urban.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think we've all seen other cities and how they're handling this specific issue as it relates to public hearings. I think these platforms, Zoom and other platforms, are perfect for study sessions and other types of public meetings where we're seeking input and whatnot. But specifically as it relates to public hearings, as I look at the Wheat Ridge transcript notice for the hearing on Monday, April 13th, it indicates that the hearing, public notice of City of Wheat Ridge, notice of public hearing is hereby given that the Wheat Ridge City Council will conduct public hearings on Monday, April 13th, 2020 at 7 p.m. in the City Council chambers, Municipal Building at 7500 West 29th Avenue, Wheat Ridge, Colorado. And so as I look at that, it's not just saying that we will hold a meeting, it specifically states that we will hold this meeting in the City Council chambers and gives the address of where it will be. And so from a legal standpoint, maybe the city attorney can weigh on this. I'm having a hard time mincing words here that says it will be on Zoom or anything else in there, because it doesn't say that. It says we are holding this public hearing in the City Council chambers. And right now there's nobody in City Council chambers, correct? Besides maybe Jesse's back there. So that's my overarching concern as it relates to this, is that we can have these kinds of meetings, we can make emergency decisions, but because we are in a literal state of emergency, and I would like nothing more than to move these public hearings forward, I just don't think we can ask the residents to participate. And to prove the point a little bit further on short-term rentals tonight, we didn't have a single participant from the short-term rental community participating in a discussion about their business. And whether they felt fine with whatever they read and they decided not to participate, that's one thing. But I think part of the lack of participation was the state of emergency. And specifically tonight, as we started the meeting at 6:30, the governor of Colorado was giving a statewide address to deal with this emergency. And so we're asking residents to choose between, attending a city council meeting or listening to what the governor has to say. So right now is not the time to be holding public hearings. And I understand that this puts us in a difficult position with those that have already applied and have had first readings. But at that first reading, we indicated in public notices where this would be held, and it's not going to be held there. So I'm not sure how we get around that.
I had, if no one wants to respond to that, I have another counselor, so I will go to Mr. Stites.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess I would ask Mr. Dahl maybe, or Patrick or somebody, in answer to Zach's question first. Maybe that might be fair.
Okay, do we have a response out of Mr. Dahl or Mr. Goff?
Sure.
How would we proceed?
Let me say that to the extent there have been notices that now are inaccurate, we would need to post some new notices. Obviously, those notices got triggered before we were in quite the situation we are now, because those notices are put out, some time ago. Certainly, it's the council's discretion to postpone some hearings if that's the council's choice. We should probably have a little more discussion, perhaps, about the laying aside the issue of a notice that got published with the city council physical address, and just take more generally the example of a new first reading, a new application that comes in that is going to be set for hearing, and are the series of opportunities that have been just now described sufficient. And clearly there are multiple ways to participate. So I think it might be helpful to separate discussion a little bit between the three hearings that are set for the 13th. And I think Patrick Goff or others can determine whether all three of those notices reference the city council chambers. Not sure that they did, but it might be helpful to separate between those three hearings and hearings generally. And we might want to have discussion on those two issues separate from each other, because they really are, they raise separate questions. And I think the constraints on hearings generally are the legal constraints are much less. Now, your own personal kind of political, social views on that are absolutely yours, and it's the council's discretion to, even despite the additional opportunities, choose to postpone. But that's my opinion, somewhat different and larger policy discussion. So maybe we ought to just at least get some data around these three hearings, because I think it's possible I'll call it a distraction from the main topic of, do we continue with government generally with the tools that Jesse and Allie have described? And that's a fair discussion. I'm happy to have it, but it probably should be a separate and a larger discussion from, what do you do about these three that are set? And all three notices are the same, are they, Mr. Goff? Do we know?
I don't know. The not to put Steve on the city clerk on the spot, but the city clerk's office puts out the notices. So I'm assuming, like you said, Mr. Dahl, notices were made weeks ago for the public hearing. So I'm assuming they still said the public hearing would be in the council chambers.
That is my understanding, yes.
Okay.
The notices actually went out whenever this was put on the long-term list of agenda items.
Thank you. I wasn't quite sure. Ms. Dozman, did you have your hand up?
Can I finish real quick? Sorry.
Okay, Mr. Stites.
So I guess my other question is for Mr. Dahl. Earlier in the week, I sent you an email and you responded back, but I was just hoping maybe you could detail out the two procedures. One was for public protest. If we did allow the hearings to go on, how would somebody file a public protest? And then the question was asked a couple of times tonight, but was one of the questions asked, what if they don't like the outcome of that vote and they want to go for a referendum? What are the steps involved with that?
Well, the protest procedure it's in the charter. It's also in the code, as you well know, and it authorizes the property owners 20% of any one side of the property that's to be rezoned, or for that matter, 20% of the owners of the property to file a protest for the start of the public hearing. And if it's a valid protest, then that triggers a 3/4 majority voting requirement on the council. As council that was here in September last year will recall, council went through in detail the protest procedure and enacted an ordinance that really gives you step-by-step procedures for filing a protest. That resulted in a handout that the Community Development Department staff put together that's widely available. I think I sent a copy to you, Councilmember Stites, and we can go through that in detail if you'd like, but on balance, it's file a protest before the start of the hearing. If the protest is filed before first reading, the hearing goes ahead and go ahead and have the hearing, and because it gives you plenty of time to determine if the protest is eligible. Often they aren't, because people misunderstand exactly where the 20% is, but we have a process, and that's built into this ordinance that council adopted last fall, a process for the staff when the protest is received to review it and determine if it's a valid protest. If it comes in after first reading and before second reading and is determined to be valid, then it automatically kicks the hearing over for a meeting, so that the council and everyone can be prepared for that. That's the protest process. The availability to do that is really pretty widespread. I think we've received protests by email, PDF. We've received protests by them being brought in, by them being mailed. So it's pretty easy to have a protest, have it reviewed for sufficiency. And if it's then sufficient, council is put on notice that it's sufficient. It's going to take 6 votes for that rezoning. So that's the protest process. Regarding initiative referendum, let's remember that initiative referendum are available in the Constitution and the city's charter for legislation. That's more than just rezoning ordinances. That's any ordinance. You can get referendum on any ordinance that's not an administrative ordinance, but an ordinance, changing the code. For example, the ordinance changing the protest process and detailing it would have been subject to referendum, or someone could have initiated that ordinance. And without taking much more of the council's time, the city's charter grants the right of initiative referendum, says how many signatures you have to have, and has some time deadlines, and stops there. And the rest of the detail for implementing initiative referendum is left to the statutes. Some cities enact their own ordinances on procedure, but the city of Wheat Ridge has not. So we go to the statutes, which still require people to sign petitions and to file them. And as I mentioned in my email to you, I don't think that changes much under the present circumstance. I want to get to the governor's order and the stay-at-home in a minute. But until the legislature acts to change the procedure for filing an initiative or filing a referendum petition, it remains the same. So the question may arise, well, what about the governor's order, and does that or does that not preclude people from going out and physically signing things, from filing referendum or initiative petitions? I'll tell you, I don't know. I suspect that there will be inquiries about that, and it wouldn't be inappropriate. I'm happy to generate some inquiries to the Attorney General's office that advise the governor on this, because I'm sure Lots of people are asking that. Well, local government is an essential business, an essential critical function, as we know, and that's why, if necessary, all of you can leave your homes to go to do something involved in conducting your roles as city council members. Because local government's a critical business, is it also a critical business to exercise your right of initiative or referendum? I suspect that question just didn't get asked when the governor put together that stay-at-home order. And let's be honest here, a lot of things are happening quickly. They're mostly focused on people's health. Some of these follow-on questions, I think probably hadn't been asked, but I'm certain will be. And with respect to initiative referendum, I would suggest we have a little time, because unless and until a rezoning ordinance goes to second reading and is approved, the time frame for referendum doesn't even begin to run. So I'm happy to commit myself to inquiring into that. I'm certain a lot of people are, and I think on that one we'll get guidance from the Attorney General's office, because that's who's going to have to do that. There's a state system. Half of the municipalities in the state, I'm sure, rely on the state statutes, as does Wheat Ridge, and the legislature relies on the state statutes to get referendum on legislative bills. So to summarize, I think for the protest, for the the 3 public hearings we have set, I think it's because those notices say city council chambers, those hearings probably need to get adjusted. For new ones, that's a kind of a policy discussion for the council. I will tell you that I believe legally there are multiple opportunities for the public to participate, and I think that they are not disenfranchised. You can make your policy decision about whether, despite that, you do or do not want to have public hearings take place. That's a lot of material, and I'm sure there are follow-up questions. Happy to answer.
Well, thank you, Mr. Dahl. Oh, sorry, Mr. Mayor. And thank you, Allie, for all the hard work that you and your team did for that video and everything else. I got a couple of texts while it was going from people saying it's phenomenal. So that's good. So I appreciate that. My only and my biggest concern, and it's one that I think was brought up before, is what about people who don't have internet access to be able to get the notice for the meetings, not be able to participate in the meetings, because they can simply do that with a call and channel 8 or just on the phone. But if there is no in-person city hall and we're just relying on the newspaper, I would think that we do need to talk about postponing next week's hearings, certainly. But what if there's a technical difficulty in the middle of our hearing or near the end of it, and we have to start over, come back another week? What happens with that?
Let me take up both. I can take up both of those questions. On the newspaper itself, if the way that you access notices of public hearings now is reading Wheat Ridge transcript. Wheat Ridge transcript is one of those critical businesses. It's still being published, and it's very easy. In fact, the city will probably start publishing notices that say, here's how you can attend those meetings. So I get that notice, and if I'm one of the people out there that doesn't even have an iPhone that I can't log in, I can do a number of things. Certainly I can watch Channel 8, or I can do YouTube, but you have the call-in ability that is a part of the notice. So if the question is, what about people that just have the Wheat Ridge transcript? My answer is they still do. And I get it that those 3 notices had that defect, but to the extent going forward, we have the ability to, and I'm certain we will, add all of these various ways to participate into that notice that's published, then that addresses that. And your second question was, sorry.
What if there's technical difficulties, or we've seen it a couple times with people dropping out tonight, but what happens if the entire call were to freeze, or a portion of city council couldn't participate for some reason?
Well, I'll say this, and we saw it last meeting. There was an inquiry, gosh, did Channel 8 go down? And as it turns out, it hadn't, because a number of other people on the call said still up. I don't view that any differently than a council member having to leave during a meeting to go to the bathroom. If we lose a quorum, the mayor we'll call a recess. If we have what I'll call more of a system-wide breakdown, where it's more than just one council member who's out for a little while in the back, as if they'd gone just gone out to get coffee, then I would expect that what I would be advising the mayor to do, and I'm sure he would be to call a recess and allow the technical problems to be fixed. And the mayor would do very much what he did last time when the question was asked about whether Channel 8 went down, as we learned it hadn't. But he said, let's declare a recess and confirm. We did some confirming, got people back together. And I think we would do that. No different than I was in a council meeting, there was a terrible hailstorm, nobody could hear. And after a while, it became very clear that we weren't hearing the witnesses. The mayor calls a recess. I was in a council meeting where the power went out and it got very dark in the room and the mics went down. When you think about it, we address those kinds of problems already. And the fact that we're on video is not that different. It's maybe a different set of problems, but we have all the same tools for saying, okay, time out, let's do this or that. In an extreme case where the power went out and it's clear we're never going to be able to come back together, then the mayor would declare that the meeting is recess until a future time, and then we post a notice. No differently than if there had been a really severe power outage in the city building and it was dangerous to remain in the building. So I'm trying to think of various examples, I guess, to give you assurance that whatever technical difficulties we have, we can treat them in the same category as this kind of in-person technical difficulties we have. And we have all those tools to deal with that.
Thank you, Mr. Dahl.
Yeah.
Additional discussion. Mr. Johnstone.
Yeah, I just, as it pertains to the two public hearings scheduled for next Monday, I just wanted to let council know that we did send out new notice to the adjacent property owners, and we did post the properties within the statutory timeframes with information pertaining to the virtual meetings. So it sounds like we need to follow up and see whether that got corrected at all in the transcript. It sounds like for Mr. Urban, it may not have, because those notices went out several weeks ago, if not a month ago, I think. But so that could be a fatal flaw, but I just wanted to know that we have updated the adjacent property owners and the posting on the property to inform people of the virtual meeting.
Ms. Nosler-Beck.
Can we just, with the posting on the properties and with just from the public comments that people had earlier, I mean, I know we can't not post moving forward, but is there any other way of notifying? I'm just trying to think creatively outside of just going through it the same way that we've always done it. Do you guys have any ideas? That's what I'm saying.
One thing we might consider doing, and I haven't talked to Ken or Patrick about this because it just occurred to me, is the place where everyone is now is the grocery store. That's a good place to post a notice as well, because everyone's there and they're there apparently every day, as far as I can tell, driving past the grocery store in my neighborhood.
Mr. Dozeman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So some of my biggest concerns pertain to the fact that most of us are supposed to be staying at home unless for essential outings, which is usually the grocery store. But if they were to want to do a public protest or a referendum, usually that's by going in and getting signatures, so being out of your house and seeking those signatures, and whether that's deemed as essential or not. I think that's one of my biggest concerns, is that we want people to be staying at home to prevent the spread of COVID-19, and therefore, I don't want to necessarily be encouraging them by way of continuing like business as usual when it's not really business as usual for in any means. And so that's one of my concerns. And another one of my concerns is that whether it's a public protest or public notification and how people are receiving that. Like I said, it's not business as usual, and I can't anticipate our public to try to maintain and stay up and plug into these meetings on a regular basis. I mean, we've seen tonight how many technical difficulties we've had, and Mr. Johnstone, if you said that maybe those notifications didn't go out or weren't updated in the transcript, then I would be in agreement of at least postponing next week's until we can maybe discuss and hash this out a little bit more. But we are here to protect the rights of and represent those that voted us into this office and the constituents of Wheat Ridge. And I think we would be doing ourselves a disservice by not allowing them to participate and like everything's shut down. So it's really hard to just kind of continue as if, you know, nothing's vastly different. Thank you.
Additional discussion? Ms. Hutchinson.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, thank you, Mayor. The stay-at-home order that we have now doesn't allow for citizen response. We need to stay 6 feet away from other people. So there's no way that if there was a protest that people could go door to door. You're supposed to wear a mask, and then you're using what? The same pen and things. That's a health issue there. Not everybody has a computer, they don't have the internet, and they also may not even have cable. So you have to have cable to get channel 8, don't you? So a lot of people just use an antenna. So they may not be getting that information. And as far as posting at a grocery store, a lot of the citizens are older, and maybe there are people in their neighborhood that are doing shopping for them. And so they wouldn't even see that. So I feel that the public hearings need to be postponed until the governor releases this order for the safety of the citizens, and that so that all the people who want to participate can do that. And I see a large amount of the population that would not be able to participate in this type of a forum. So that's my position on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Weaver.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess I'd like to go back to what Mr. Dahl had said, that there are two issues, right? We need to decide what we're doing for next week's meeting. And so my first question is what is the legality of the fact that the notice went out in the transcript as an in-person meeting? Are we legally obliged to find another date for that meeting because of that notification? Sorry, that's a question for Mr. Dahl.
Mr. Dahl?
Pardon me, I started coughing just when you asked me that question.
Did you hear it? Do you want me to repeat?
No,
Okay.
I've got it.
Okay.
For that meeting, and those three, I think there are 3 hearings, to the extent there's a defect, it may well be that very few people are affected by the defect, but nevertheless, if someone is, then you assume that there's a defect. Procedurally, how to deal with that is very easy. At the same time, there are a lot of people that aren't affected by the defect and would expect to participate and would log in on one of the many ways. Probably the majority of people would log in one of the many ways. So you need to address the needs of both of those categories of people. You can't just ignore one category and not the other. So the easy way to do that, pardon me, would be simply to take a motion. You open the hearing because it was set. Immediately take a motion to continue it to a date certain. And if that motion passes, then it's continued. And
Mr. Dahl, would you like to take a moment and get a drink of water, please?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
City does that already when the hearing goes late and it needs to be continued for more testimony, whatever. So that would be how you could deal with the 3 hearings that are set for the 13th pretty easily.
Okay.
With respect to the stay-at-home order and what that means for people's participation in government, I guess that's an absolutely serious question. Councilmember Hutchison and others have raised it. And I would think that it's fair for us to lean on the governor's office and the AG's office a little bit to say, is what you're saying that local government should stop operating? Because we have public hearings, we have public meetings. Must we stop adopting ordinances? Because ordinances in Rige, of course, require public hearings. Mm-hmm. So the ordinance you're talking about, short-term rentals, that's a public hearing. When you're ready for it, do we stop doing that? And maybe we do. But I think some guidance from the governor and the attorney general's office on that subject would be helpful. It's clear to me from this meeting that those are fair questions to ask, because they won't go away. If you continue the hearing for a month and we're still under a stay-at-home order in a month, then prior to that hearing, what are we telling people? Because now they have a notice that says it's scheduled for sometime in May. And at some point you need to be able to give them good guidance. And I would hope that that guidance is, we're not going to do government that involves any kind of public participation until the COVID-19 pandemic is over with. I have to believe that the cities work around these things. Mm-hmm. There was a pretty good attorney's listserv entry the other day from an attorney that practiced in Alaska for many years. And she said, I have to weigh in and say that in Alaska, we've been doing all sorts of public meetings remotely for years because there's just no other, you can't get people physically together. It's capable of being done. I'm taking too long to say, I think that we, on the items for the 13th, you can take those simple motions, roll them over for a month and see what happens, and that's probably the right thing. For other hearings going forward, I'd like to be able to do research and report to you about what our opportunities are and what the governor's office and the AG's office are saying around that. I think it's a real fair question for them, and I expect they're going to be able to answer it.
Mm-hmm. Those questions aside, and I appreciate you explaining those. I do feel and am in agreement with you that we've created ample opportunity for people to connect. In fact, I think we've connected more because the problem before all of this happened, which I think Wheat Ridge Speaks really spoke to, if you will, is that we had other people who were not able to come to in-person meetings because of the time, because they were working, because of lots of different things in their lives. And so in many ways, I really believe that the access has gotten better. The protest procedure aside from what Mr. Dahl was just explaining. But I really, really appreciate what the city has done as far as enabling the Zoom. I think the Wheat Ridge Speaks opportunity is a great way for people to be able to list in public comment before the meeting happens. And I feel like we've created more opportunity, the next meeting aside, because of the noticing issues for people to involve. And as long as we are going to be considered essential workers, like grocery, like other things, I do believe we should continue in this format. Thanks.
Thank you. Additional discussion, Ms. Hoppy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to say, when you lost me for a few minutes, I was on my phone, and then I was able to get back on my phone on Zoom, and then I was able to get back on my computer. So I was able to just call in. It was super easy, and I could hear what you guys were all talking about. I do, you know, I agree with Councilwoman Weaver. For a very long time, we heard about how people can't participate because they can't be physically at the meeting. And so I think that we have actually expanded those opportunities. I would like to just make a quick point that there is a difference between a protest and a referendum, but I want to clarify, if there is a protest by a neighboring property and it requires more than
We're losing you.
Protests can be sent in separately. They don't have to be written on the same piece of paper.
Ms. Hoppy, we're losing your
Taking my thing off
transmission.
the Wi-Fi. Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So I keep kicking my family off the Wi-Fi. I keep texting them, get off the Wi-Fi. But what I wanted to say is, if there's a protest, that doesn't have, and so, you know, that gets signed. And so I just wanted to make sure that that was correct. Is that true, Mr. Dahl?
And I'll ask Ken to correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no requirement that it be on the same piece of paper. We get protests in the past, and think about it. It's 20% on any given side, per all the detailed rules that council appropriately did last September. We add them up and check with the dimensions and the legal descriptions of the lot and block numbers, and make certain that, yes, they are the owners, etc. But if we get 3 pieces of paper, or 3 pieces of paper that have been emailed or PDF to us, we're able to check those, and that's a fine, easy way to do it. There's no requirement that all those owners sign on the same piece of paper. I don't see it in the code, and I don't see it in the handout. Ken, do you agree?
Agreed.
Super. So I just wanted to make sure that the citizens understood that you don't have to go knock on your neighbor's door to be able to utilize the protest process. And then I just also wanted to ask, these 3 public hearings, when did we put the posting on the property? Like, how long has the posting been on the property? I mean, these are second hearings, so they've already gone through a first hearing and through planning commission. So how long have these been in the works? November, December?
Well,
the applications have been in for variable times. I'd need to do some research on that, but they've both been heard and recommended by the planning commission. The third one is a right-of-way vacation, and that does not go to a planning commission for the recommendation. But yeah, the transcript notice gets published immediately after first reading. That sets the public hearing, and that's why you know, we just didn't know that our world was going to change in the way that it has. But again, the website, the property posting, and we sent out an additional mailing to adjacent property owners. So from that standpoint, we have our that portion of the notice covered legally. So just to piggyback on Mr. Dahl's comments, I think if we were to open the public hearings, that keeps the people that have already received that notice of this meeting on notice. And if we continue it to a date certain and get that new notice published in the transcript within the statutory timeframes, we can get those. We could get those done in about a month.
Thank you. Additional discussion? Ms. Soltine.
Mr. Mayor, I have 2 questions. What would be the impacts of delaying these? You know, none of us really know when this is going to come back online and we're going to be back in the building. So if we were to say for the next month, we were to delay hearings, just how would that roll out and how would that impact things in process?
Mr. Goff?
Yeah, thank you, Council Member Hulteen. I can speak to at least the Clear Creek Crossing public hearings, and on next week's agenda, we do have 2 items that are relative to the Clear Creek Crossing project. One is an issue with the Lutheran Hospital development, and the other one, as Ken mentioned, is just vacating a portion of right-of-way. You know, I'm not sure if delaying just for a couple of weeks would have a huge impact, but if we continue delaying anything that has to do with Clear Creek Crossing, that delays probably the time that the developer has and when they're going to potentially issue bonds for the project. And that what that means is that delays when the city gets reimbursed for the hook ramp project, which also, as you all know, as we've discussed in the last couple of meetings, with the COVID and the impact that's going to have on our revenues, we may have some difficult cash flow issues here coming up in the next several months to continue paying the bills for the hook ramp project. We had a meeting today to discuss where we are on that, and we are essentially at the $10 million mark. So we've spent most of our 2E funds for the hook ramp project. We have potentially another $7.5 million that we are obligated to pay. And I had that discussion today with the developer. I said, you need to get those bonds issued as soon as possible so that the city has the cash flow. But they can't issue bonds unless the project continues moving forward on some of these public hearings that they have scheduled. They're not going to issue bonds unless they have leases in place with final tenants. So it does impact the city greatly, at least on the Clear Creek Crossing project.
Okay, and then my next, well, it's really more of a comment suggestion. I am so impressed with all the increased access to the meetings that the city's invested in even before the COVID-19, and then you know, the video and being able to get Zoom going. I do agree that, you know, it's the accessibility for more citizens is impressive, and I'm grateful. One thing that when I think about how hearing meetings play out and how citizen comment is typically before the agenda item for a hearing, if we do move forward with continuing to have hearings, I think it would be helpful both for us as city council people and also for the citizens who are actually calling in or on video to participate, if they would be able to provide their comment before the hearing item instead of doing those comments at the beginning. And I just share that because sometimes the information that comes up in the presentation is impactful. And I know, you know, for me to hear those comments right before we're having discussion, it really helps me keep our citizens' viewpoints in mind. So that would just be a suggestion if we go forward with that.
And that would have been the process. We were only taking citizen comment at the beginning of the meeting for everything that's not a public hearing. So once we have public hearings on the agenda, we would take comments at that agenda item.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think, you know, when we get down to brass tacks, we have 2 types of public hearings, the ones that are contentious and the ones that are not contentious. And so we, at some point in the future, and this circumstance presents a pretty good case as to why we need to be able to do public hearings in a virtual setting like this. I would say that if we're able to postpone the hearings for Monday night, that's in line with the discrepancy in the public notice, and postponing that a month doesn't sound like it's going to put too tremendous of a impact on the city, but we do need to get this public hearing on the Clear Creek Crossing development done sooner rather than later. And it's not as contentious as some others might be. And not to say we have to decide up front which is going to be contentious and which is not, but if we're going to learn how to have a public hearing in a virtual setting, I'd rather do it with a non-contentious public hearing than one that we have a good inkling that it will be contentious. And so I hope that we can at some point be able to do a public hearing in this manner via Zoom and all that. But if we have an inkling ahead of time that it's going to be contentious, I would prefer to do that in person and not let that be our first go at having a public hearing online. And I don't know if we have, can we choose which ones we do online and which ones we don't, or how do we parse that out? Maybe that may be a question for the city attorney as to, can we pick and choose which ones we want to do online and leave the rest till we get back in the building, or do we have to do it, one or the other?
Mr. Dahl?
Well, I think you can adjust dates for a public hearing. What I would want to do, I think, if a given hearing were going to be later, would be to make sure that I gotten some kind of consent from the applicant, because otherwise you're really treating the applicant for one hearing unequally.
Right.
They are honestly entitled to due process. If due process for all rezoning applicants means you wait until August, okay, they're all treated the same. But if due process means we've decided that you are going to wait till August and you get to go in May, then I think that's a real due process violation for the applicant in August, unless that applicant waives that concern. This is a little bit uncharted territory. I've never had to think about how to favor one, favors the wrong word, but how to treat rezoning applicants differently based upon what we think the public level of public participation would be. So I'd want to give a little more thought to that. I think maybe our interim solution, which I think has been generally discussed, is let's see if we can move the hearings on the 13th. And it may well be that one of them still has to get moved even further. But let's at least treat them all the same for now, to the extent we can. Let me give a little thought to the due process concerns your question raises, Councilmember Urban. But that's my first reaction, is that kind of subjective determination of who gets a regular hearing and who has to wait, I think I would avoid.
And to add to that, depending on the type of ordinance that we're considering, or the type, in this case, it's an amendment to an existing planned mixed-use development. And so that there may be some context relating to ordinances that are an amendment to something versus something that's brand new. I don't know for certain, and I don't want to necessarily hash it out tonight, but some kind of delineation as to the type of ordinance or type of public hearing that's being considered.
Yes, and I may give some thought to that too, but you'd have to have rules for that kind of set out ahead of time, so that all the same classes of thing were then create more classes. You set them out and say, okay, here's the lead time for this kind of hearing, here's the lead time for that kind of hearing, because then you're making the distinction on the kind of hearing, not, oh, that's you. Well, then I think that's going to be later. That's what I'm trying to avoid, and I think there's a way to work around that.
Thank you.
Mr. Goff?
Yeah, I was just going to mention, just to put this in a little bit perspective, the good news is I think we're only dealing with these 3 public hearings next week. You look in the future agendas, we don't have any first reading scheduled for any land use type cases, unless Ken has something that I don't know about yet that hasn't been added to an agenda. So I think once we get past next week's meeting, I think we're in the clear for a couple of months. So we're probably just talking about these 3 public hearings right now.
Thank you. Additional discussion? Mr. Johnstone?
Yeah, I just piggyback on that. I think we do have some subdivision plats coming up, which do require public hearings, but then are adopted by resolution, not by ordinance. So that's a little different situation, but they do require a public hearing. And then the other category of public hearings that Patrick, I think a little bit alluded to in his comments about, thinking about how to keep Clear Creek Crossing moving forward, our planning commission hearings. So we have a virtual planning commission hearing scheduled for April 16th to review the come and go site plan, specific development plan is what they're called. We have three others of those that are in process right now. A Foothills Credit Union corporate office that's getting very close to being ready for public hearing. The restaurant retail district, which probably realistically is on hold for a little bit right now, given the uncertainty in that industry, but that could change quickly too. They've been under review for some time. And then lastly, we have a Hampton Inn that is under staff review, and I think we'll move forward pretty quickly. It's in good shape. So that, these are hearings that could be coming up probably for the Foothills and for one of those other two that could happen potentially in May. So it's our intent to keep those virtual planning commission meetings moving forward unless we hear differently from you all.
Thank you. Additional discussion? Okay, it looks like we pretty well discussed this around council. If I were to summarize it, it sounds like that we might want to come to our meeting next week and postpone these 3 hearings that we have scheduled because we don't have the correct noticing on that. And then Mr. Dahl has some research to do with the governor and the attorney general in the state and his colleagues around the state with respect to how we might proceed with that. Does that look like a possible course of action?
Would we set that as an additional agenda item as it relates to public hearings, or will that just be a discussion tacked on to the continued public hearings?
Mr. Dahl, what would your recommendation be there?
On the existing public hearings, they will get opened and then a motion to continue. And I'm fine with it generally being said out in the world that you're anticipating continuing. So the phraseology would be to not postpone, but instead to continue. Since you did notice it, you open the hearing, motion to continue to a date certain. So that takes care of that. With respect to whatever I'm able to determine on research, we could certainly have it as an agenda item, but I think it might be as easy as me just reporting to you during city attorney's matters what I have learned.
We would have the opportunity to deal with it at that time, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think I'd be reluctant to put an agenda item out there without really knowing what it is that I will learn or what opportunities there are for you to even act. And I wouldn't want to mislead not only you, but more accurately the public. Oh, this is what they're going to decide that night, because I don't know yet around that.
Mr. Goff, does this provide the information that you need, you think, this discussion that we've had with council?
Yeah, I believe so. As it doesn't sound like we have much of a choice if we didn't advertise these correctly. So we'll double check that also to make sure that to see what the last advertisement in the transcript actually was and said. And then we'll bring that forward next week. And if we have to continue these, we will. As I mentioned, besides what Ken Johnson just mentioned about some planning commission meetings and hearings, Janice Hoppy and I will look at future calendar and see how this will impact us in the future, if at all. And of course, that all depends on when we actually get back into the council chambers. So at this point, not any. We have a meeting on April 27th, and the governor's order right now is through April 26th. So we could potentially meet on the 27th.
I hope so. You know, I have to tell you that my house doesn't have quite the quality of snacks that we have down at City Hall. So Does that conclude our discussion on this item? Is there anything anyone else would like to bring up on this? Okay, then we will conclude that item. And I believe that concludes our agenda items. Got another piece of paper here, but I would like to go to elected officials matters. And because I was delinquent in not calling upon our city clerk at my last opportunity to give him a chance to speak, I'd like to ask our city clerk if he's got anything under elected officials matters. And you've got to unmute.
Only to profusely thank the staff for the hard work they're doing to make the trains run on time and the city operate. While we're down here in the weeds dealing with these details that are critically important, let us not lose sight of the fact that the city is still operating thanks to our hard work, and more than that, thanks to the staff, the PD, everybody who works for the city. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you. I would like now to go to our city treasurer, Mr. Miller. Do you have any comments for us tonight, Mr. Miller?
No, I don't have anything to update the council on tonight. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I believe we have the rest of our participants here. I would sort of do this by raise of hand rather than going through. Are there elected officials matters that our councilors would like to bring forth now? Just raise your hand. Ms. Hoppy.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to mention that Councilmember Stites and I started our small business gift card sales drive today, and the Rige acupuncture and massage. And my internet connection is unstable, so I'm just going to say, everybody be safe and stay well.
Thank you. Mr. Goff.
Sorry, guys, I have a couple more items. I just want to make sure you're all aware of. We're all working on, we're working on our biannual resident survey. We do that every other year, and it typically goes out about now to our residents. We are going to recommend that we hold off on that. We just don't think it's good time. People aren't paying attention. They're in a different state of mind. I think the likelihood of getting a good return rate it's not going to be very good. Plus, I don't know if we're going to get great responses, even if people do fill the survey out. Everybody's in a really different state of mind right now, and maybe not thinking about the questions that we're asking in the resident survey. So if I don't hear any different from council, we would like to postpone that and potentially even push it out to next year, or maybe in the fall if things turn around more quickly. Any issues with that?
Seeing none, that sounds fine.
Thank you. And then the last item, the other item, I think you all received the emails from a couple residents talking about small cell and 5G deployment in our city. To kind of cut to the chase, the FCC has taken that authority away from local governments. We cannot put a moratorium on the installation of small cells in our city, and we have to allow them. We actually have to, once a permit is submitted to the city, we actually have to act on it within 60 days. If it's a small cell on a current pole that is in place, if it's going to go on a new pole, I think we have 90 days for that. We do have the FCC has given us a little bit of authority, and City Council acted on that, I think in 2018 maybe, or 2019, where we do have a little bit of regulatory process that we can put in place. They have to file for a permit, and there's only a couple items that we actually have any control over, and maybe Ken can speak to that if he'd like. But so first of all, I think those emails that you were getting were asking for us to put a moratorium on these. We cannot do that unless Mr. Dahl has a different opinion of that. And, just a little bit of background on this. There's a lot of discussion out there in the world about this type of technology. And you may have seen in the news recently in Great Britain, people are saying that this technology has started the COVID crisis. And they're actually burning down these poles that have the 5G equipment on it. So there's been a lot of theories out there that this technology causes medical issues and health issues for folks. There's really no significant data, empirical, medical or scientific data that says that's the case. But there's some folks that believe these are health hazards, and I believe that's why you're receiving these emails right now. They're trying to use the COVID-19 issue as an excuse to go after the 5G technology. The city of Wheat Ridge is a member of the Colorado Communications and Utility Alliance. It's a consortium of cities in the Denver metro area that works on issues such as this. And the attorney that represents that agency, Ken Feldman, is currently stuck on a cruise ship, unfortunately, in Miami. So he did respond to my email, though, and they're trying to put some standard language together that we could use to respond to citizens who send us these types of emails. So I'll try to get that information out to you all as soon as we receive it. But is there any questions on that, Jerry or Ken? Do you have anything to add to that?
No, really, let me add that the city did put together regulations for small cells that are really kind of the state of the art for small cell regulation within the limitations allowed by the federal law, which was really tilted heavily toward the industry. But nevertheless, we put together good regulations. I actually worked with Ken Feldman in doing that. And so there is a process for a permit application. We address things like not putting it mid-block and some camouflaging requirements. And so we've used as much of the regulatory authority as we have under the federal law. And I absolutely agree with what Patrick and Ken Feldman have said about the inability for the city to place a moratorium. But that said, the city's in a reasonably good place, as good or better than most cities in terms of its ability to regulate what it can on small cells.
And as far as I know, I'm going to get more information from staff, but I don't think we've been overrun with applications for new cell towers throughout the city. So it's not really an impact on our staffing. And as those emails had suggested, that city staff shouldn't be spending time on these during the COVID event, but they're really are not causing any additional staff burden as far as I know.
Thank you. Mr. Urban?
Since we're on the topic of conspiracy theories, I just wanted to call out one additional, more despicable conspiracy theory that I've come across in the past few days. Actually, it was propagated by a local business owner named Jim Meeker, who was pushing forward a hashtag called "Film Your Hospitals" in an attempt to indicate that the COVID-19 virus is somehow a hoax of some kind, that hospitals are empty. And I just find that absolutely abhorrent. And I would encourage residents to stay away from these types of conspiracy theories. And it's putting our first responders and our healthcare workers in harm's way when you propagate that kind of BS. So please, spend your time thinking about other things other than, the conspiracy theory of the day. So just put that out there. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have other elected officials matters? Ms. Dozeman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I wanted to thank Councilmember Urban for bringing that up. I've been seeing some posts about that on Facebook, and I want to ensure you that our healthcare workers are definitely on the front line of this, and this is definitely a real health crisis that is happening in all over the world. But I just wanted to say that even though I'm not entirely surprised at the extension of the stay-at-home order. It has been disappointing, as well as the Jefferson County Public Schools deciding not to do in-person learning at for the rest of the year. And so I know that a lot of us are feeling the pressure of not only being a parent, but also being a teacher, and some of us still also having to work. And so I wanted to thank all of city staff, all of our healthcare workers, all of our first responders, and everyone that's just doing what they can and really addressing this issue, and taking it day by day. So I just want to send out a heartfelt and sincere thank you to all of you. You guys are making the world go round.
Thank you. Do we have any other official, elected officials matters? Ms. Hutchinson.
Thank you, Mayor. I want to agree with Patrick that I really believe that most people are not functioning at 100% with everything that's going on. It's sensory overload. It's not the uncertainty of what's going on. But one thing I do want to bring up is it's spring. Go outside, listen to the birds, look at the flowers that are starting to bloom, see what's coming around. There's another side to this, whatever it is we're going through. And it seems like Mother Nature is plugging in here. So when we had a beautiful day today, and I took my dog out to go to, well, his business on our break, and it looks like a full moon, a big full moon out there. So just kind of look at your environment, see what the changes are going on, and there's some really good things that are going on out there. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional comments from our counselors? Okay, well then I think we're ready to wrap this meeting up. I would like to thank all of our counselors for joining us tonight, and our staff. I think staff's done a great job. Please be aware that we've got a training opportunity to work on this Zoom platform that our staff has put together. There's something tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. There's something Thursday at 4 o'clock. So we will be right here on Zoom doing a demonstration. Tomorrow is about fitness. I will not be in spandex. I may be in my overalls on Thursday for the Farmers Edition, but we'll see what happens. I want to put a real thank out there to our first responders, our healthcare workers. We have a lot of great people in our city. I want to really drill home on the governor's order to stay home. I think it's really important that we take this seriously. You know, I think we are in an emergency situation, but we're not in a crisis. We've got leadership at a good leadership at the state level and our county and local level. I think it's up to our citizens to take this to heart. We are the home front in this war, or the front line on this war is on the home front, and we are all workers on the home front, and everyone here has an opportunity and really a duty to sequester themselves and to stay safe and healthy. So I want to thank all of our healthcare workers and the people that are really coming together to make this to make it so that we get through this emergency. So anyway, if there's no further business to come before council, thank you all for joining us. Please stay safe out there, and we will see you at a meeting soon. So thank you all very much. Good night.
Thank you.